no treaty with Saudi Arabia for mutual defense. They're not a military ally. So why is Donald Trump talking about going to their defense in a conflict with Iran that they've been stoking for years and years? Check it out. And don't forget to ding the bell, share this in our channel with other people, subscribe, and leave your comments. So remember this? This was Trump in a campaign rally back in 2016.
Saudi Arabia, and I get along great with all of them. They buy apartments from me. They spend $40 million, $50 million. Am I supposed to dislike them? I like them very much.
Right. He loves Saudi Arabia. They give him lots and lots of money. Something is rotten in Denmark, as they say. Over the last hour, we've been talking about, we went through the history of the Yemen war. We went through the history of Saudi Arabia, from the Wahhabists to Osama bin Laden, how George Bush the Elder's little war, on behalf of Kuwait with Iraq led to the creation of a U.S. Air Force base in Saudi Arabia, which is why Osama bin Laden struck us on 9/11. Something that, I think most Americans, if you were to say, why did bin Laden hit us on 9/11? They say, well, he hated us. Well, wait a minute. He used to work for us. He was part of the Mujahideen. They were trying to throw the Soviets out of Afghanistan. We were funding him. Go back and watch the movie, Charlie Wilson's War. Read the book. So why did he suddenly start hating us? Because we built an Air Force base for George Bush Sr., for his little war in Iraq, his little 100-hour war, so that he could get himself reelected. Didn't quite work out, but that was his plan. Have a little war, get reelected, like Reagan did with Grenada. LBJ thought it was a great idea. Let's have a little war in Vietnam. That didn't work out so well either. I don't know about Harry Truman in Korea. I don't know if there were, if he was trying to get himself reelected or not. But in any case, that didn't work out. I mean, that led right to Dwight Eisenhower saying, I'm the peace candidate. Vote for peace. Vote for Eisenhower, 1952. But in any case, we went through all that, and here we are with Donald Trump saying, I love the Saudis. They give me money. You just heard him say that. And then he's saying, Saudi Arabia bought, a couple of days ago, he said, they want $400 million worth of stuff from us. No, it's nothing close to that. But they're still, they're buying $400 billion. They're buying billions of dollars worth of military from us, certainly. Not from us, though. Not from you and me. They're buying it from the billionaires in the defense industry and the multimillionaires in the defense industry. Sanctions can starve people, they can keep them from getting medicine, and they can even get racists out to vote. But that's about it. Professor Richard Wolff weighs in. Check it out. Leave your comments, ding the bell, share it with your friends, and subscribe to our channel. Welcome back. Thom Hartmann here with you. Professor Richard Wolff is on the line with us, the economist, co-founder of democracyatwork.info, the author of numerous books. His latest, The Sickness is the System, When Capitalism Fails to Save Us from Pandemics or Itself, now available also as an ebook. And rdwolf with 2fs.com, his Twitter handle, Prof Wolf, as in Professor Wolf with 2 Fs. And Dr. Wolff, the sanctions on Cuba are back in the news. President Obama had removed some of those sanctions. Donald Trump put them back on. Now there's a lot of pressure on Joe Biden to remove them, and hopefully he will do so. I think it's just good policy. But in the larger frame, in the kind of grand scheme of things, have economic sanctions ever worked as a foreign policy tool? And for that matter, do they even make sense, if not for foreign policy purposes, economic sense?
Well, the short answer to your question is they don't work and they don't make any sense. That is, they don't make any sense as policy or as economic objectives of any kind. They do make sense in the pandering to particular groups of voters, and I think that's mostly what these things are about. And let me explain. The sanctions against Cuba, which are a good example, but we could use those in place against Venezuela or those in place against Russia and all the others. They tend to, unless they're very unusual, they tend to harm large groups of people. In the case of Cuba, literally the entire economy because of that, the way they're structured. And what that does is hurt everybody. And that doesn't make the United States any friends. Number two, it solidifies the opposition to the United States. It organizes people to support their own government because they're all together, people and government, struggling against the imposition discussion of the sanctions, at least symbolically, then it irritates, let me put it this way, it irritates our allies because these sanctions are then used to punish companies, say in Europe, that do business with Cuba or that do business with Venezuela or that do business with Russia. And this irritates them because they are their own businesses. They don't want foreign governments telling them what they can or cannot do any more than American companies would like it. And then here comes the economics. They're easily evadable. In other words, you can get around them. If you can't trade directly with somebody, okay, then you have them send it to a third country, and then it comes from there to you. That way you're not violating, strictly speaking, what the law or the embargo or the sanction specifies. They're nuisances at best. Their economic effect is very small. And here's the bottom line. They haven't worked. We've been sanctioning countries left and right. No one in the world sanctions other countries like the United States. We are the global bully in that regard. Everyone sees it in that way. It doesn't do us in the long run any good as a nation to do it. But here's what it does. It does, and in the case of Cuba, it's very obvious, it does pander to whatever voters, Cuban refugees that have come to the United States, get them to be less hostile or more sympathetic, and so it plays to that kind of voter audience. In other words, it's a domestic tool used for domestic political advantage. Economically and politically, in terms of its effects abroad, zilch.
So it seems to me like it's almost a form of warfare, a low-grade form of warfare that doesn't involve bombs and bullets, in as much as when people in other countries feel like they're under attack, in a war, there's this, rally around the leader effect. And we certainly see that, we've seen this in Cuba now for 70 years. And yet, there needs to be, or I think there's a kind of a general consensus that there needs to be some sort of response to things that are done that are, for example, I think you've got Joe Biden now going after, some of the folks in Russia over the poisoning of Navalny. Weirdly, he's not going after Putin, who apparently ordered it, or the giant hack in 2017, apparently also from Russia. How can a country respond in a way that doesn't involve bombs and bullets, and that does cause another country to say, maybe we shouldn't do this again because there will be a price to pay? I mean, is there an economic vehicle for that?
Not much of one. I mean, let's be real honest, at least for a moment, to look at it from the standpoint of other countries. Around the world, it is widely believed that the United States has intervened in elections in other countries for decades and decades using sophisticated or not sophisticated military, civilian mechanisms. The spectacle of the United States being angry at other countries for doing what it itself has done strikes everyone as odd. If you wanted to say something, there are forums in the world where you would be listened to, where you are not required to bully anybody. You can demand meetings in the United Nations. You can make a public fuss over it. You can demand that the International Court get involved. There is a whole variety of ways of making it politically and ideologically uncomfortable for the other side. That doesn't work all that well either. I don't want to be misleading anyone. But these economic sanctions were designed to make it appear, and that's all it is, appear that they're somehow harsher or they're somehow more effective. They aren't. They're an admission that there isn't all that much you can do if you don't like the behavior of other governments. It's a normal thing in our world, I wish it weren't, that we don't like what all different kinds of governments do. But as Mr. Trump showed us, and as Mr. Biden has showed us again, even when we know, as well as we'll never know anything, that the head of Saudi Arabia arranged for and sanctioned the literal butchery of a journalist that was critical of him, neither the President Trump nor President Biden saw fit to do pretty much anything significant in terms of the relationships between us and that country. And the world sees it. So if you still keep doing this kind of symbolic slapping people on the wrist, it looks more and more like what it is, which is political pandering to voters at home with something that isn't scary, isn't dangerous, doesn't work, but looks like something.
Would a middle ground? I mean, thinking from 60,000 feet, looking at this like from the point of view of the United Nations. How do you pull into reasonable behavior a rogue state? Do you withhold foreign aid? I mean, because if you're not going to use troops or bombs, pretty much all that's left are jawboning or economics. Or am I missing something?
No, you're not. But to do something that's really economically effective, you'd have to have a weapon that allows you really to do that, and we don't have that. Or you could use so massive a weapon that it would have such devastating effects that it would be effectively counterproductive because it would hurt too many people in too obvious a way. It's very easy in these governments, even when you have a general sanction, to shift the burden of whatever the sanctions are off of the people who make political decisions in these countries and on to the people who don't and who are made to suffer even though they're not responsible for what these governments did. It's frustrating. I understand that. It's frustrating for other countries to watch what the United States does that they don't like and don't agree with. But one of the reasons you have the United Nations, and you had the League of Nations before it, was we're not supposed to interfere in each other's internal events, and sanctions are a way of trying to do that, and they just don't work. That's why they've never worked in the past. We don't have policies in Russia that we like, or Venezuela, or Cuba, and that's despite having done this for such a long time.
Iran is not gearing up for war. They're trying to gear up for peace, or at least that's my opinion. Check this out. Leave your comments, ding the bell, share it with your friends, and subscribe to our channel.
I'm watching you on YouTube, and I want to present a case to you, and I want to know what you think about it, what you think the pros and cons are. And this is my argument. I think that if anybody could pull this off, it would be Joe Biden. What do you think about if Joe Biden were to work with Iran on moving them towards becoming an ally? What that would serve is peace between Israel and Iran, maybe more stability in Iraq with, more stability concerning Saudi Arabia, maybe peace with Saudi Arabia, and maybe peace in Syria. And Lord knows that they've showed great restraint. They kept up their part of the bargain even after they were pressed and pressured. And, I think that they've shown great restraint. And I think that the people have an appreciation of America. It's not really the people. I mean, we love their people too, I think. Most people I know. I think that I would like to see more partnership with Iran. I think that we would make a good partnership with them. And I think that we can move forward with bringing something about with maybe turning them into an ally instead of this pressure to make them a foe. What do you think?
I absolutely agree with your perspective, Deborah. What Iran has been saying and doing for the last really 40 years is, we're a large, Iran is a substantial country. As I recall, their population is like 70 million or in that neighborhood. It's a huge landmass. I mean, this is a big country with an ancient heritage. They have been continuously a continuous government, more or less, for about 700 years. Nobody has conquered Iran in that period of time. That used to be called Persia, and proud people, a unique standalone culture. Culturally, they're unique relative to the people around them. They do not consider themselves Arabs, for example, and although it's a very Muslim country, and what they have been saying all these years is, we've got Israel with nuclear weapons. We've got Saudi Arabia with more money than God and a huge American-funded military and an American, provided, sold to them military. along with the UAE and others in the region, they're saying. And we have to be able to defend ourselves. And so the way that Iran has developed to defend themselves initially was what's called asymmetric warfare. In other words, through Hezbollah, they would plant their people in Lebanon or in Israel or whatever, and kind of fund what we refer to as a terrorist network in order to say, if you attack us, we can flip the switch and turn these people on, and you guys are going to see terrorist attacks like you never in your life imagined. And they have, openly threatened that to the United States as well. And the problem, and then, about 10 years ago, maybe 15 years ago, they said, well, we can. Everybody wants us to do away with that, dial back, and this is a hyper-simplified explanation, by the way, but everybody wants us to dial back on that. So we're going to do what Israel did. We're going to create a nuclear weapon. And of course, everybody in the world freaked out, and we got the Iran nuclear deal, but they still have these connections with Hezbollah, and that's the major stumbling block. And frankly, I think that a Gorbachev-Reagan kind of de-escalation is possible if the United States was, because what we've said all along is disarm Hezbollah and stop, your asymmetrical warfare presence in these other countries, and we can treat you like, at least like, a fully honorable and full member, of the community of nations kind of thing. And Iran has said, no, we're not willing to give that up until we know that you're not going to attack us. And I think that there's a middle ground in there. I think that there's an opportunity for rapprochement. And I think that both sides are exhausted. And I think this change, this 40-year political cycle change that I'm talking about, that we're seeing here in the United States, we're seeing this in the UK as well. We're seeing this in many other countries. Now, there's also a rise of right-wing nationalism that's happening, but I think that the progressive movement is sweeping the world, and frankly, I think it's sweeping Iran as well. I mean, I don't know if you saw the pictures of the Grand Ayatollah Khomeini and Pope Francis, but the Ayatollah looks like he's on his last legs. I mean, that, talk about boomers fading. I mean, that generation is on the verge of going, and I think, like Bonnie Sauter, for example, the guy who ran for president in 1980, in August of 1980, he won the presidency of Iran with 74% of the vote on a platform of releasing the hostages to the United States. And then, of course, when he called up Jimmy Carter, when he finally became president in August of 1980, he called up President Carter and said, I want to release the hostages. Carter would say, great, let's work this out. And so he goes to the Ayatollah and he says, let's release the hostages. And the Ayatollah says, you can't do that. We cut a deal with the Reagan campaign. And, and Bonnie Sauter, the president of Iran, writes about this in the Christian Science Monitor. And I've linked to that many times over the years. It's still up. It's still there. His article in the Christian Science Monitor where he says, I was told that we've got this deal with the Reagan campaign because we need American-made weapons. And Reagan will give them to us and Carter won't. And that's, and that's how it played out. So all this stuff has to be resolved and cleaned up. But I think you're on to something, Deborah, and I'm very happy that you called and shared that with us. Thank you. With Dr. Trita Parsi, the professor at Georgetown University, author most recently of Losing an Enemy, Obama, Iran, and the Triumph of Diplomacy. His website, tritaparsi.com, and you can tweet him at tparsi. Dr. Parsi, welcome back to the program.
Thank you so much for having me.
It's always great talking with you. I always learn something from you. I'm curious your take on the current state. I mean, we've the U.S. government is arguing that they've got video of an Iranian Army boat or Navy boat coming up to one of these tankers and removing a mine from the side of it. The owner of the tanker is saying, no, it wasn't a mine that hit us. We've got Seymour Hersh. I'm going to play that clip, after we talk. Where Seymour Hersh was talking some time back about how he had reported I believe it was for the New York Times, that Dick Cheney in a meeting had suggested that the U.S. Army build a couple of these boats that look identical to these Iranian boats and use them to provoke an incident in the Gulf, to have a war with Iran. I mean, this is getting bizarre. What's solid? What isn't? What do we know? What do we not know?
We know extremely little, to be frank, because I think, frankly, that the so-called evidence that the administration has put out has actually confuse people more because it's just so weak. I mean, these videos hardly show anything. First of all, we don't know if it's the Iranians. Secondly, removing a mine does not mean that they put the mine there. In fact, if they were there saving some of the sailors who were on that boat, which is something that crew members of the boat themselves have said, and they see that there's an unexploded mine on the boat, it is the responsible thing to remove it. And they may have done so precisely because they wanted to collect that evidence and see who actually did do this. So we don't know. And if the administration actually has any evidence, they should be putting it out in a way that actually is convincing, rather in a manner that only really strengthens the impression that the administration is willing to start a war with Iran regardless of what the facts are. I mean, coming out with a press conference within hours of this incident really signals this strong desire for escalation, because there's no way that by that time they would have already been able to have a strong assessment of what had happened. And I think another point that is very critical to understand in all of this is that Pompeo did not come out in the press conference and say that he had an intelligence finding. In fact, he didn't use the word evidence even once. What he said was that he had a government assessment. There's a significant difference between the two. An intelligence finding is actually based on facts. It comes with various degrees of confidence. It has some specific standards. A government assessment is essentially just his opinion. There's nothing more to it. There's no standards. There's no degrees of confidence or anything like that. But he used that word because I think he thinks and he knows that it carries more weight than it actually does have. It sounds more important and serious than it actually is. And I think that's a specific way of trying to deceive the American public.
Now, on 5 different occasions during the Obama presidency leading up to the 2020, as I recall, 2010 and 2012 elections, Donald Trump tweeted that any minute now Barack Obama, then president, is going to start a war with Iran in order to help Democrats or in order to help himself get reelected. Obviously, Trump thinks that a war with Iran is a good electoral strategy for a president facing reelection or whose party is facing reelection. And one of the press narratives is that you've got, Bolton and Pompeo, who are, Bolton in particular, enthusiastic about a war with Iran, and Trump, who is enthusiastic about talking about a war with Iran, but doesn't really want the responsibility of having an actual war with a real country that can fight back, that hasn't been weakened by years of sanctions and incompetent governance like Iraq was under Saddam Hussein or Afghanistan was under the Taliban, and that that dynamic is going to somehow keep us safe and keep Iran safe. I'm kind of skeptical of that media narrative. What are your thoughts on what might be going on in the White House and how we should be understanding this?
My own impression is that actually what Trump tweeted back then may have been his assessment then. I don't think it is his assessment right now. He knows quite well that he actually did carry a lot of states because of his strong anti-war sentiments and his message and being very critical of the Iraq War. That, however, is not the case for Bolton. Bolton clearly supported the war. He helped lure the American people into it. He continues to say that the Iraq War was a success. His track record of wanting war with Iran is impeccable. It is more than 2 decades long. I think what is happening is that Trump wants to get to the negotiations. He doesn't know how. The Israelis, the Saudis, Bolton have presented him with a path that is based on maximum pressure. It sounds good on paper. They've convinced Trump that that is the way to go, but they themselves know that this is a strategy that will fail to secure negotiations, but rather will drive the United States into a corner in which Trump's only way out may end up being military action, because that is their objective.
Now, Iran says that they're going to, in the next 4 days, going to be exceeding the uranium concentration, or whatever the proper word is, threshold that was set in the Iran deal, in this multi-nation agreement that Donald Trump pulled us out of. what does that mean? I mean, are they saying that they're going to go up to that point and stop, or are they saying that they're just going to break through and you know, the deal is falling apart? And how are the Europeans responding? Are they attempting to, for example, break through some of the sanctions? Where are we at on that?
So the Iranians are saying that they're now going to start breaching some of the limits that the deal imposed on them. This is more than a year after the U.S. walked out of the deal, more than 2 years after the U.S. has undermined any sanctions relief and actually reimposed the sanctions. What they are doing, though, is very easily reversible. And they've already signaled that if the Europeans start living up to their obligations under the deal, which means that they have to start trading with Iran as they were before Trump reimposed the sanctions, then they will then reverse these measures and go back into full compliance. I think it indicates that they actually do want to be in compliance, but they are absolutely sick and tired of being the only country that actually is adhering to the deal. Because as much as the Europeans are speaking very positively and sending strong political signals about how important the deal is, they are not abiding by the deal. They are abiding by Trump's sanctions. They have stopped all purchases of Iranian oil. They have stopped a lot of airlines from Iran to land in Europe. All of financial transactions with Iran essentially have been stopped. They are not adhering to the nuclear deal. They're adhering to Trump's sanctions, the very same sanctions that they object to and believe are illegal. Nevertheless, they're adhering to it. And the Iranians are now essentially saying, well, there's going to be a cost for you if you don't live up to the nuclear deal, but live up to Trump's extortions. I hope this doesn't go too far, because I think it would be a very, very bad thing if the deal collapses altogether. But what the Iranians are doing was completely predictable. The Europeans frankly believe that the Iranians would do this sooner. I think we've all been lucky that the Iranians haven't done this thus far.
Now, for some time, it's been fairly apparent that the hard right in Israel, Netanyahu in particular, and the hard right in Saudi Arabia, which is basically all of Saudi Arabia, Mohammed bin Salman, have wanted Iran to be in a war. By and large, they have wanted Iran to be in a war with the United States. Not them, but Saudi, correct me if my memory is incorrect, but I believe Israel has struck Iranian nuclear facilities in the past. It was more than a decade ago. If Iran was to exceed the threshold of the deal, and if, for example, Israel or Saudi Arabia were to do some small take out a nuclear facility in Iran, where could that lead? And if this becomes something that resembles the beginning of a hot war, what are the possibilities in your mind that the United States and Russia being Iran's ally, the U.S. being the ally of Saudi Arabia and Israel in the region, might end up in either a proxy war or an all-out war? And we have about a minute and a half here before we hit a hard break.
The risk for a big war is very significant. The idea that there could be a small attack and that it would be contained and that the Iranians would not retaliate is very, very unlikely. But if you want to sell a big war in these circumstances, you will try to market it as a small war. That's the only chance you have in actually being able to get it. And the scenario that you pointed out, that the Israelis would take military action as they did against Iraq back in the early 1980s, would most likely lead to a wider war. And this is a big worry that the Obama administration had, because it would mean that the United States would get dragged into a war at a time that was not of its choosing, that it would be a time of Israel's choosing. And as bad as a war is, it's even worse if actually the timing of it is chosen by another country that does not communicate with the United States on these type of decisions. So this is a very, very serious and dangerous situation, and I think particularly mindful of the track record of Bolton lying to the American public and fabricating evidence, the track record of the Trump administration's contentious relationship with the truth, the track record of the Israelis and the Saudis trying to push the United States into a war. We have to be extra cautious when it comes to any type of statements or evidence put forward by any side, including the Iranians here, because this is literally a matter of war and peace.
So a listener to our program called in from Wyoming and said that he had voted for Trump because Trump said he was not going to have any more stupid wars. Boy, is this guy rethinking fast. Check it out. Leave your comments, share it with your friends, ding the bell, and subscribe to our channel. Robert in Mills, Wyoming. Hey, Robert, what's up?
Hey, Tom. Good to talk to you again. I finally got DirecTV back so I can see again.
Cool.
So what I want to talk about, Tom, is, talking about the legality of this war that we've been in for 17 years
right.
plus. The whole thing is illegal. Even though I supported President Obama with the bombing of ISIS, 2,800 sorties. He's supposed to be a weak president. Well, you bomb a country, 2,800 missions. I think that's doing a pretty good job. But where was congressional authority here? In other words, what I'm saying, this whole thing goes back to George W. Bush or George H.W. Bush and the illegal invasion. I see no declaration of war.
Yep.
None whatsoever. Nobody talks to Congress. And, of course, if you call your congressman, or in my case, congresswoman, the offspring of Mr. Cheney, you get no answers. And, no, you don't. You really don't, Tom.
Yeah.
Of course, she's happier than a pig in a poke that we're dropping bombs all over the place. And I called up Senator Engie's office, and he doesn't have a statement yet. Of course, thank God he's not running again. And it's a funny thing, Tom, that when I brought up that the idea, of we have to defend Israel, if I hear that one more time, I'm going to scream. There's a country, I brought it up, the young lady that's working in the office, that Israel, back in 1967, defeated 6 countries in 6 days and defeated one country in 6 hours.
Right.
And she didn't know about it. And I'm thinking, well,
this is MikeEnzie's office?
You didn't hear about the 6-day war? She said no. Or maybe I don't remember. How can you...
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying, Tom? I mean, what are you teaching
I get
in
it.
these schools?
But Israel is a democracy and it is an alliance or an ally. But using Israel as an excuse for everything is not fair to Israel to begin with. Not to mention, just lousy politics. It seems to me that the reason why we're in the Middle East is, and that this just as easily could have been, the Caribbean. When Margaret Thatcher had her little war with the Argentinians over the Falklands, that took her popularity. She was in the tank because she had just busted the coal miners union and the people in the UK, and she was talking about privatizing the National Health Service, and she was privatizing the railroads, and people were seriously upset with her.
Correct.
And she had her little war with the Falklands, and boom, her popularity went above 70% suddenly.
Yeah, I remember that.
And Reagan looks at that and goes, well, I can do that. And so he has this little war with Grenada to get himself reelected in '84. And then George Herbert Walker Bush says, well, okay, I've got to have a little war. And so April Gillespie, Saddam Hussein had been agitating for some time. He was really upset that Kuwait was slant drilling under the border and sucking oil out of the pools of oil underneath Iraq, illegally. But instead of going to the United Nations, he comes to the Bush administration and says, Kuwait used to be our 47th district or whatever it was called. It used to be a state of ours.
19th province.
19th province. Thank you very much, Robert. And we would like it back. We're going to take it back. What do you think? And April Gillespie, April Gillespie was on this program, to her credit. And April Gillespie was like, that's your business. It's not our business. And so Saddam goes into Kuwait and says, okay, guys, you're stealing our oil. We're going to stop that. And then we get the daughter of the Prince of Kuwait, or the King of Kuwait, or whatever, the Emir of Kuwait, pretending that she's a nurse, testifying before Congress that the evil Iraqi soldiers are taking babies out of incubators and throwing the babies on the floor and stealing the incubators. It was a complete lie. It was totally manufactured. But that gave George Herbert Walker Bush the excuse to invade Iraq with his 100-hour war. And then, Tom, following that, we had all these sanctions.
All these wars, Tom, been manufactured going back to Vietnam.
That's my point. Going back to remember the Maine, in 1898 or 1899, whatever the Spanish-American War, whenever that happened.
That's right. Tom, they could be telling the truth, and I don't believe them anymore.
Yeah.
And I've been a Republican for years. In fact, I voted for Trump because, remember, the endless wars.
Yes.
Remember, Tom?
Oh,
the endless wars?
I do, and a lot of people did vote for him.
I'm getting you out of there. Okay, fine.
Yeah.
And then I see, next thing I see, 3,000 troops going to that desert out there, which was a manufactured country to begin with Sykes-Picot.
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean,
So the bottom line here is, Robert, that the reason why we're in the Middle East right now is because George Herbert Walker Bush decided he was going to have a little war just like Reagan did. That little war turned, there was a remnant left over from that. Bill Clinton kept that going with the sanctions to be a tough guy, right? Mm-hmm. Nobody wants to be the one who gives into Saddam Hussein. And then George W. Bush came along and said, okay, now they're weakened to the point that we can easily overthrow the regime. Let's come up with some BS excuse, and him and Cheney cooked the intelligence. This is a series of Republican wars that are completely unnecessary. Robert, I got to move along, but thank you. You nailed it. And what's astonishing to me is how completely amnesiac our media is, particularly our television media, about the origins of all this stuff. Where this started. This started with Reagan and Bush Sr. and, carries on to this day. So does Donald Trump think that the only way he can get reelected is if we're in the middle of a war, and when that little war in Venezuela didn't work out so well, he's trying to start one in Iran? Check it out. Leave your comments, ding the bell, and subscribe to our channel, please. Stephen Miles, the director of Win Without War. This was one of the organizations, I believe, that emerged out of George W. Bush's saber rattling. Remember when George W. Bush gave his State of the Union address? I believe it was the one in 2002, in February, March of 2002, when he said that there was this axis of evil, a phrase that his speechwriter David Frum had invented. And he said that the axis of evil was Iraq, Iran, and North Korea. And, that we had to take them out. And immediately what happened was Iran and North Korea started building nuclear weapons. And Iraq said, we're not going to do nuclear weapons. We're not the axis of evil. Saddam Hussein he's writing a romance novel trilogy right now. We've got nothing. Send over the inspectors. Come on, you can look all through our country. Bring Hans Blix. Bring Scott Ritter. Check it out. It's all good. We have nothing to fear. And the UN scoured the country from end to end, and they couldn't find anything. And George W. Bush went to war with them anyway, and they had nothing to do with 9/11. And George W. Bush and Dick Cheney went to war with them anyway. They lied us into this war. And what happened when the war was finally resolved, in quotes? What was the first international business to open in downtown Baghdad, in Iraq? It was the Bank of Iran. Iran and Iraq have become allies. Iraq has a Shia majority. The Iranians are Shia, more or less. And so they're good buddies. So there's a significant Shia presence in Iraq now, and all Trump is saying now is any American interest is attacked, we will go to war with Iran. Now that could be a bunch of American soldiers in Iraq who get attacked by forces, any kind of forces, local warlords or whatever, who ever got any kind of support at all from Iran. And in fact, Stephen Miles, the director of Win Without War, said the latest indication is that this administration is running full speed directly into a major war with Iran. And then referring to Trump's tweets about this, he says, this is Bush and Iraq in 2002. The time to stop their disastrous war plans is now. Meanwhile, the headline over at the New York Times, this just went up today. The headline, U.S. officials raise alarm of Iranian threat targeting American troops in Iraq. You get this? Senior American officials said on Monday that new threats by Iran against U.S. troops in Iraq were behind the sudden deployment of an aircraft carrier strike group and Air Force bombers. Shades of Gulf of Tonkin. Shades of Remember the Maine, shades of, hey, wave that bloody shirt of 9/11 when you attack Iraq, which had nothing to do with 9/11. In fact, Iraq, Saddam Hussein was the bitter sworn enemy of Osama bin Laden. But that didn't matter. We went to war anyway.
Our president will start a war with Iran because he has absolutely no ability to negotiate. He's weak and he's ineffective.
So the ideological battle over America first is heating up, and Israel's at the core of this. Marjorie Taylor Greene yesterday tweeting, anyone slobbering for the U.S. to become fully involved in the Israel-Iran war is not America First MAGA. And then Laura Loomer posed, how is it not America First to congratulate those who just made sure Islamists who chant death to America and who openly plotted to assassinate President real Donald Trump never had an opportunity to have a nuke? Tucker Carlson weighs in, saying politicians purporting to be America First can't now credibly turn around and say they had nothing to do with the strikes. So then comes Donald Trump, and he said, well, considering that I'm the one who developed America First, he can't even lie about this, right? America First was a movement in the United States in the 1930s. It was a Nazi movement. It was a pro-Hitler Nazi movement. And so anyhow, he says, considering I'm the one who developed America First, and considering that the term wasn't even used until I came along, I think I'm the one that decides that. Right, which is, I think pretty much proof that Trump is running a cult. He's the decider. He's the one who gets to define terms. And then yesterday he said, America First means many great things, including the fact that Iran cannot have a nuclear weapon. What does that have to do with anything? I mean, America First and Iran? The editorial board of the Washington Post this morning published a piece. The headline, Bomb Iran, Trump needs to think about what happens next. And they talk about how Netanyahu has given no indication that he's going to pause this thing. I believe he's hiding out in Italy right now. But the bombing, the Israeli bombing of Iran has expanded to include airports, manufacturing plants, and local police stations. Notes the editorial board of the Washington Post, quote, these facts suggest that Netanyahu's real goal is to hasten the fall of the Islamic Republic. And then they cite the fall of Bashar al-Assad in Syria, and what happened in Libya and what happened in Afghanistan and Iraq. I mean, just going into the Middle East and blowing things up does not help. And they note that Trump seems, this is a quote, Trump seems torn between two competing camps among his supporters, the pro-Israel, anti-Iran hawks who want to see America join the Israeli bombing campaign, and the isolationist America First crowd. And then they note recent history should inspire caution and mention, Muammar Gaddafi. Meanwhile, Trump apparently just lit out on Pete Hegseth, on Kegger Pete. He called Kegger, well, we don't know exactly what he called him, but Michael Wolff, who has written several biographies of Donald Trump and has apparently some really good contacts inside the Trump administration, said that Trump has pissed off our soldiers. And so that's why the troops appear to be, quote, having a good time rather than displaying the menacing military face that Trump wanted. Wolf says he kind of reamed out Hegseth, demanding to know who staged this and complaining about the tone problem. Meanwhile, he desperately tried to spin the event as a tremendous success, bragging to reporters that it didn't rain, even though everybody saw the rain. Donald Trump is promoting a false Harris crowd size conspiracy. This is totally weird. It started with Dinesh D'Souza, who's, kind of nuts himself. And he tweeted or X'd or whatever you call it, a picture of the crowd by Kamala Harris's plane, and had little circles around the one of the engines and the fuselage of the plane, which is highly polished. And he said, why isn't there a reflection of the crowd on these surfaces? Well, the answer to that question is because these are curved surfaces. They're not flat like a mirror. And curved surfaces don't show reflections the way flat surfaces do. It's a completely different thing. But Dinesh D'Souza is apparently not smart enough to know that. And so he tweets this out, and Donald Trump sees it and goes, holy cow, there's a conspiracy here. And he goes and he tweets, he says, where he does it over on his failing Nazi-infested social media site. He says, has anybody noticed that Kamala cheated at the airport? There was nobody at the plane, and she AI'd it, and it showed a massive crowd of so-called followers, but they didn't exist. Yeah, right, they did. The Harris campaign replied with a, quote, actual photo of a 15,000-person crowd for Harris Walls in Michigan. The Harris campaign also used that opportunity to point out that Trump has not, well, this is what they say, Trump has still not campaigned in a swing state in over a week. Low energy? Yeah, right. And on Saturday, Trump went nuts because Harris is now saying, let's eliminate taxes on tips. And now Trump is like, yeah, she's a copycat with her no taxes on tips. It's not fair. Well, you know, it was Reagan. I mean, taxes on tips have been around forever, but it was Reagan who changed the law in a way that made it easier for employers to nail you and the IRS to nail you for your tips. Meanwhile, Donald Trump is claiming that Iran has hacked his campaign. And some guy named Robert sent a bunch of internal Trump campaign documents. Apparently the vetting, the Oppo report, the opposition report on J.D. Vance, some 40, 50 pages of, you know, dirt on Vance. And it got sent to Politico. Now, Politico is taking the position of, you know, we're not going to publish this because it came from a hostile government, and that wouldn't be right, which is a little different than the position everybody took in 2016 when it was Hillary's emails. But this is Trump's emails, or you know, J.D. Vance and, you know, the campaign's emails. But I'm wondering if Iran actually did this. I mean, just imagine if you're the Trump campaign and you know that you've got a person who was in on these discussions, on these email chains, who got a copy of the opposition report on J.D. Vance, and who is dissatisfied, who's going to quit, who's upset, who has been sexually harassed, or who didn't get paid, or who just had a change of heart. And you know, or you believe that that person is going to reveal this information to the press. What do? You try to get out ahead of it. You say, oh yeah, well here, we'll give it to the press first and we'll claim that it came from Iran. Now, I have no evidence for this. This is purely a conspiracy theory on my part. Let me be very clear. But it makes a lot more sense to me than that Iran hacked these and handed them off to Politico. I mean, you would think that if Iran hacked them, they would release them to media that they know would publicize them. Or for that matter, I mean, there's you know, these phony publications they'd send them to, or they'd send them to the New York Times and the Washington. I mean, you know, they'd spread them much farther. It appears to, so, you know, this is, like I said, this is my personal conspiracy theory, but I'm very skeptical. And the fact that Politico is holding this stuff close to the vest, that's just weird. So, anyhow, it's also astonishingly ironic, you know, given that one of the reasons that Hillary did not win in 2016, although she did win 3 million more votes. You know, John Fugelsang is saying if Harris wins, this will be the second time a majority of Americans voted for a woman. War is coming. Where will the blow fall first? Asks Malcolm Nance over on his Substack newsletter, malcolmnance.substack.com. And I was completely unaware of this, and I consume a mind-boggling amount of media. And this is, I mean, he writes, the Trump regime quietly, and apparently incredibly quietly, started moving about 1/3 of America's strategic bomb force from its home base in Missouri to a secret remote airstrip in the middle of the Indian Ocean called Diego Garcia. In late March, a mass of U.S. Air Force in-flight refueling tankers were seen staging all across the Pacific Ocean from California. This indicated that an air armada was being formed and needed nonstop in-flight refueling. Within a day, 6 B-2 Spirit stealth bombers were detected landing at Diego Garcia in the middle of the Indian Ocean. So where would you bomb from Diego Garcia? Turns out, Iran. Trump sent a letter to Iran's supreme leader, writes Malcolm Nance, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, demanding they stop developing nuclear weapons and return to the negotiating table. Iran rejected that proposal out of hand, quoting the Signal app scandal, noting that Trump's cabinet says one thing in public while plotting something else in private. So here we are. Trump, of course, famously blew up the JCPOA, the Iran nuclear deal, back in 2017. And Nance notes that Netanyahu has likely convinced Trump that now is the time to strike the Iranian nuclear weapons program once and for all, which is why we're positioning these B-52s. And then he goes on to add, the U.S. has deployed over 100 additional combat aircraft to the theater to support an attack. He also ordered the aircraft carrier USS Carl Vinson to depart its deployment in Asia and head at top speed to the Arabian Gulf. It's going to arrive in about 2 weeks, and when it does, all the pieces will be in place for what could be the beginning of World War III.
2 minutes.
He writes, if this attack is carried out, the entire Middle East will be set on fire. Iran has some options, and one of them is to strike Saudi Arabia, which is our ally. The Iranians would also shut the Gulf, between the little choke point between Iran to the north and Oman to the south, stopping all fuel trade out of the Gulf. So you can see the price of oil go to $150, $200 a barrel overnight, which would give us, $10, $15 a gallon gasoline. This, and then J.D. Vance visited the U.S. Space Force base in Putvik, Greenland, with his wife Usha, and said, our message to Denmark is very simple. You have not done a good job by the people of Greenland. This has to change. And Trump explicitly did not rule out military force against Greenland. Now, it looks like he's actively preparing for an assault, for a strike on Iran. And, the Iranians are no dummies, and they control a lot of proxies, around the Middle East, and this will be a real mess. But he's also suggested that he might, park an aircraft carrier off the coast of Greenland and say, this is ours now. Putin can take Ukraine, we can take Greenland, which, of course, would cause Xi to say, well, then I can take Taiwan, right? And then, depending on how and who responds, like I said, we could be in the middle of World War III. This could be a real mess. And you'll recall, I've talked before about Strauss and Howe and how they point out every 80 years you have a depression followed by a war. In 1871, you had a great crash that was followed by, 1771, that was followed by 1776 and, our war with England. 80 years later, we had the crash of 1856 here in the United States, a widespread depression that led straight to the Civil War in the 1860s. 80 years later, we had the Republican Great Depression followed by World War II. And it's now been 80 years since the end of World War II. So, get ready. Meanwhile, a Trump critic and Nobel Peace Prize winner just got his U.S. visa revoked. I'll tell you about that after the break, and I'll pick up your calls. Stay with us. It's the Thom Hartmann Program, defending America from the weapons of mass deception. Stay with us. Did Israel assassinate a nuclear scientist just to prevent Joe Biden from working out a nuclear deal with Iran? Trita Parsi drops by to discuss. Check it out. Leave your comments, ding the bell, share it with your friends, and subscribe to our channel. Not on the topic of creeping fascism, but very much on the topic of creeping fascism. Here in Oregon, 2 days before Thanksgiving, a young man, Aiden Ellison, he was 19 years old, was shot in the chest in front of a hotel down the road here in Oregon. And he was shot by another person in the hotel, another guest in another room. These two guys didn't know each other. And this young man, Aiden Ellison, 19-year-old kid, had the music in his car on, and this white guy came up and said, that's too loud, basically. And they got in an argument about it. The white guy pulled out a gun and shot Aiden Ellison in the chest. Aiden Ellison is not white. He's a black guy, and he's dead. Just down the street from me, as it were. I mean, this is a nationwide friggin' epidemic. It's absolutely screaming poison. And I think we're trying to get Trita Parsi on the line right now. But Donald Trump, going along, Donald Trump says, postal worker, there are many mailmen, they're in big trouble right now for selling ballots, getting rid of ballots. Trump's latest delusional fantasy, or sales pitch to his neo-fascist base, is now, the mailman did it. This after, he cut their overtime, he ordered them to slow down the mail, he destroyed 600 sorting machines, and now he's blaming the post office for his loss. It's mind-boggling. It is absolutely mind-boggling. Dr. Trita Parsi is on the line with us right now. Dr. Parsi has been with us many times in the past, and one of the most thoughtful commentators we touch base with here is the executive vice president of the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft. QuincyINST.org is their website, and his Twitter handle is tparsi. Dr. Parsi, thank you so much for joining us. I'm looking at this Iranian scientist, Mohsen, perhaps you could say his name. I'm not sure how to pronounce it. Thank you very much. That has been assassinated. He's the top nuclear scientist in Iran. He was very, very well protected. Israel has apparently assassinated other Iranian nuclear scientists in the past, and it's widely believed that they're responsible for this one. And now we've got Jared Kushner going to hang out with Mohammed bin Salman, and last week we had Mike Pompeo having a secret meeting with bin Salman and with Netanyahu. What is going on in that region?
Well, what is happening is that these countries, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Israel, who strongly oppose the Iran nuclear deal, they strongly oppose any reduction of tensions between the United States and Iran, because they fear that if the nuclear issue is resolved and U.S.-Iran relations improve, the United States will have an easier time leaving the Middle East militarily. That if that happens, they will be in a more problematic situation, at least the Saudis and the UAE will be, because they can't necessarily fend for themselves, and they're enjoying a balance of power right now that they cannot create on their own. They can only create it by the United States being there militarily. The American public wants to leave, but these countries are now trying to create as much obstacles as possible to make it impossible for the Biden administration to reduce tensions with Iran and resolve the nuclear issue.
So you're suggesting that it is possible, or are you asserting that Israel assassinated this nuclear scientist not to cripple the Iran nuclear program, but to make it politically impossible or very, very difficult for Biden to have any kind of rapprochement or work out any kind of, back into something like the Iran nuclear deal?
What the Israelis and the Saudis and the UAE fear is not an Iranian path to a nuclear weapon, it's an Iranian path to Washington. In the past, we have seen clearly that the timing of these assassinations, and the Israelis have conducted several of these, they have not coincided at moments where the Iranians have been on the cusp of making a major nuclear breakthrough. They've coincided with moments in which there was diplomatic breakthrough that was about to happen. And that's exactly where we are today. In 7 or so weeks, Biden is going to become president. He's already said he wants to walk back into the nuclear deal. Netanyahu said last week that Biden absolutely should not do that. And this is his way of preventing Biden from doing it. But what's important in all of this to keep in mind is that I think it is quite unlikely that Netanyahu would have done this if he felt that, without some sort of a green light from the Trump administration. But he must also have felt that Biden doesn't have the political will to do anything about it, to impose a cost on Netanyahu for deliberately sabotaging Biden's diplomacy. Only Biden can correct that perception that Netanyahu has.
And how would he do that?
Well, by being much more firm with these strategic partners that the United States have in the Middle East, who have become increasingly reckless and increasingly willing to undermine U.S. national interest in order to advance their own interests. I mean, there has been a degree of deference towards these countries that is now really starting to come back and bite the United States in the back, because they're acting not only in disregard of U.S. interests, but in deliberate attempt to undermine U.S. interests.
We're not on the verge of an election. Is there anything that Americans can do other than, I don't know, social media support for a Joe Biden pushback, or re-embrace the JCPOA or whatever? Is there anything average Americans can do? I mean, or is this out of the hands of Congress?
I think Congress still plays a very important role, actually, because Congress needs to signal to the Biden administration that Biden actually has a tremendous amount of political space to do the right thing on the Iran deal, also on Yemen and Saudi Arabia. and pressure on Congress from the public, I think, can be tremendously helpful in this regard. The Israeli element is going to be a little bit trickier, but it's needed nevertheless, because at the end of the day, America's strategic partnerships are supposed to actually advance U.S. interests, not undermine U.S. interests.
Trump's Iran sanctions are still strangling that country, and until Biden is able to lift them, he's probably not going to get Iran to the table. Dr. Trita Parsi joins us to discuss the issue. Check it out, leave your comments, ding the bell, share it with your friends, and subscribe to our channel. But first, Dr. Trita Parsi is with us. He's the Executive Vice President of the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft. Been on the program many times over the years, an extraordinarily well-informed observer of the broadly the situation in the Middle East and with regard to Iran in particular. And Dr. Parsi, first of all, the website is quincyinst.org. And you can tweet Dr. Parsi at tparsi, P-A-R-S-I. Dr. Parsi, welcome back. I'm wondering if you could first just give us a shorthand kind of background on the situation with Iran from the deal that President Obama participated in, along with I believe it was 5 other nations in putting together, to Trump's blowing it up to where we're at right now, and then we can go forward with what's happening with Biden and this diplomacy. But just for those people who may not have been paying attention.
Sure. So for years, there's been tensions over Iran's nuclear program, and there was a major breakthrough in 2012, 2013 that laid the way for multilateral negotiations between the United States, Germany, France, the UK, Russia, China, and Iran. And 2015, they reached a landmark agreement that blocked all of Iran's pathways to a nuclear weapon, and at the same time lifted sanctions on Iran, rehabilitated the country politically. It was hailed by all countries with the exception of 3, Saudi Arabia, Israel, and the UAE, 3 countries that incidentally have been pushing the United States to go to war with Iran. Trump comes in, he tears the agreement apart, walks out of it, reimposes sanctions on Iran, imposes further sanctions on Iran. After about a year, the Iranians start to reduce some of their obligations, and as a result, restarted elements of the program that they had kept dormant as a result of the deal. Biden comes in. He had promised that he would quickly get back into the agreement. It's part of the Democratic Party platform that there should be a quick rejoining of the nuclear agreement. We're 6 weeks into it. We have still not seen any clear gesture by the Biden administration to get back into the agreement. Instead, we're stuck on a rather childish fight as to who needs to take the first step, which is wasting very valuable time and is likely going to make the political cost and difficulty to get this deal up and running again all the more difficult.
Give us the details on that, who takes the first step dispute.
Well, so the Biden administration started messaging that they would get back into the deal if the Iranians reverse some of the steps that they have taken. The Iranians never left the deal. They've reduced some of their obligations. And Biden wants Iran to reverse all of those steps, be in complete compliance with the agreement before he takes any step at all.
You're talking their further enrichment of uranium, principally?
Enrichment of uranium, shipping out of that uranium, specific sites that have been closed, enrichment to higher levels, all kinds of different things that are very important that the Iranians have made very clear that they will reverse all of it, assuming that the U.S. goes back into the deal. And the Iranians are very worried, it seems like, because if they allow the United States to come back into the deal without lifting the sanctions that are actually violating the deal, and essentially continues to pursue Trump's maximum pressure strategy, then their fear is that if the talks then end up hitting a snag and not succeed and break down, they will be blamed for it, even though Biden actually never changed the policy of Trump. He continued to do exactly what Trump was doing, more or less, while getting the credit for simply wanting to talk, which Trump wanted to as well, but then the Iranians will get the full blame for it. So they've been resisting. Biden doesn't want to take the first step because he's afraid of looking weak, and that Saudi Arabia and Israel and the UAE and Republicans will attack him. But at the same time, Biden did promise leadership, and leadership means taking the first step by definition. So there's an expectation that he would lead and take the first step now. And these issues, by the way, can be resolved easily behind the scenes. The problem is that once you make them public, which unfortunately the administration contributed to doing, then they become really tricky to resolve, because then it's all about saving political face.
Right, which takes us back to domestic politics. I believe Iran has a presidential election coming up this year, and certainly America is in a continuous cycle of political turmoil. To what extent are domestic politics driving these decisions on both sides?
Well, domestic politics is tremendously important, unfortunately, on both sides. The Iranians are in a tight situation. I mean, the Rouhani government only has a couple of effective months left. The elections are in June. By last 2 weeks of March, the Iranians are in an election season. As a result, cannot negotiate effectively. On this side, I think, unfortunately, the Biden administration seems to think that there is a way for them to strike a deal with Iran to actually get back into the JCPOA without paying a domestic political cost, without angering the Saudis and the Israelis and the UAE. And I simply don't think that's possible at all. I mean, Obama proved that it's not possible to do that. If you want this deal, you have to be ready to pay a political price for it. If you're not willing to pay the political price, then you shouldn't even pretend that you're interested in diplomacy.
What are you're talking about the Saudis, Israel, and the UAE. Biden has distanced himself from Netanyahu, who is, facing crises of his own as he's being prosecuted for corruption and other crimes. The Saudis, we just came out and pointed out that, Mr. Bonesaw ordered the murder of Jamal Khashoggi. And the UAE has, well, God only knows. I mean, certainly they played a big role with Jared Kushner's $1 billion. Why are we so concerned about those three countries in terms of pacifying them with regard to Iran?
I think it has a lot to do with how they can have an impact on domestic politics. But I want to say I absolutely agree with the premise of your question. It's a real question mark. Why are we willing to put their concerns and their interest and their preferences above the U.S.'s security interests? As Bill Clinton said after his first meeting with Netanyahu in 1996, who's the freaking superpower in this equation, in this relationship? Right. That seems to be a need of reminding here, because the Biden administration itself has said that this is a security imperative. We need to make sure that the Iranians don't have a pathway to a bomb. We need to avoid a war. And incidentally, perhaps even more importantly, the idea of striking this deal in order to avoid a war and avoid a weapon in Iran is absolutely imperative in order for the United States to be able to slowly but surely extract itself from the Middle East militarily, which is exactly what the American public wants. They don't want to have 58,000 troops in these endless wars in the Middle East. But without this agreement with Iran, it's a very difficult task to be able to achieve that. It's going to be difficult even with it, but it's necessary to have it because it's the one issue that actually can drag the United States back into a land war in the Middle East.
We have just 10 seconds. What can Americans do to encourage this process?
I think they can call their members of Congress and ask them to put pressure on the administration to live up to its promise to get back into the deal without causing complications.
Iran attacked Israel with hundreds of drones and missiles and whatnot. On the line with us is Jamal Abdi, the president of the National Iranian American Council, NIAC Council, NIA Council.org is the website and also the Twitter handle. And J. Abdi, J-A-B-I is his Twitter handle. Jamal, welcome back to the program. It's been a while since we talked. I've got to say my biggest concern about this, and I'd love to get your thoughts on this, is that Netanyahu is playing this thing like a fiddle. He attacked the Iranian embassy, which is sovereign territory, knowing that it was a violation of international law to do that. He absolutely broke international law. I believe he did that hoping for a response from Iran, which he now has. And I'm concerned that he's trying to drag America into a larger regional conflict just to distract basically America and the world from the mass death that he's caused in Gaza, and to keep himself out of jail, to hang on to his prime ministership. What say you?
Well, unfortunately, I strongly share that suspicion, and I'm not the only one. There are reports that even Joe Biden himself and the Biden administration believe that Netanyahu is trying to drag the United States into war. So this is not some fringe theory or some, anti-Israel talking point. The U.S. government itself is concerned that this is the case, and I think that does inform a lot of how they have navigated this issue. The degree of, I wouldn't say coordination per se, but the degree to which the U.S., I think, sort of ensured that this has been calibrated to not cross any so-called red lines that would then drag the U.S. into a regional war. I think it's very clear that's what Biden is trying to do. My concern is you see the writing on the wall, you see what Netanyahu has done so far, and the bear hug approach with the public diplomacy and sort of public alignment with Israel in hopes that in good faith, Netanyahu is going to do the right thing and is going to be respectful of U.S. interests has not worked so far. And so I'm very concerned that none of what has happened is outside of what the Netanyahu government planned for. The strikes they engaged in, highly provocative, a clear violation of international law, completely predictable, if not completely expected, that Iran would have to respond in some way. So we're still in this realm sort of Netanyahu's creation, where the ball is now completely in his court to decide what he wants to do. And Biden has said the U.S. is not going to partake in any offensive measures, which I think is positive. But Biden has not said, we're actually going to oppose that. We actually, want to protect the region from a regional war, protect U.S. interests, protect U.S. troops. And so Netanyahu, take the win and stand down, not just take the win and do whatever you want. And hopefully the guy operates in good faith. That's not what we've seen so far.
You are far more familiar with and much more a scholar of that region than am I. I'm curious your thoughts on a worst case scenario.
I think that the worst case scenario. Yeah. I think the worst case, we're talking about 30,000 people who have already been killed, 30,000 Palestinians, 13,000 children, a famine that is happening with the use of U.S. weapons. I can't think of, it's hard to think of even worse case scenarios than that. But the prospect, I think, of this becoming, Israel responds in a way that sort of all pretenses of this being what it is now, which is sort of these choreographed responses to kind of hew to the red lines and not cross those lines. If that comes off and there is a regional war and you've got Hezbollah going all in and you've got, Iranian linked actors in Iraq and Syria and Yemen going all in. I mean, we're talking about a regional conflagration, right. And we've got U.S. troops in the region who are sitting ducks.
Yeah, for sure. How would the Arab nations in the Gulf respond to, if for example, Israel takes out an Iranian nuclear power plant, or the Iranian nuclear, where it's believed that they're developing nuclear weapons. It's kind of a logical place for Israel to strike. If they did that, and then Iran responded by a massive bombardment of Israel, or activating Hezbollah or whatever, and then boom, these two countries are actually in a shooting war. How are the Arab countries in that region going to respond?
They have tried to, I think, protect their own interests, which is what you would ask of a state. So they, most of the Arab states condemned the Israeli strike on the Iranian consulate in Damascus. And so I think signaled to Iran that they are not joining with Israel as part of this. I think they notably did not condemn the Iranian response. However, they may or may not have provided intelligence to Israel to try to mitigate the damage of that response. And I think what the Saudis and UAE and others really are doing is trying to navigate this without themselves getting sucked into this war, and really mindful of, there was a period of time sort of during the Trump administration and just before where I think the sense that the United States was going to fight a war for the Persian Gulf Arab states or was going to intervene, that was dispelled. It was dispelled partially from the nuclear deal, where you had the United States saying, no, we are going to engage Iran and the states need to figure out how to share the region together, and we're not going to just play one side or the other. But then really with Trump's abandonment of the nuclear deal and some of the Iranian responses to that, the attacks on the Saudi Aramco facility, some of the ship seizures, and the fact that the United States did not get involved, I think signaled to the Arab states kind of a degree of, you have to take responsibility for this because the United States is not going to bail you out. And so I think that's what they're doing, trying to avoid getting sucked into one direction or the other. Now, if this plays out, there are many different pathways it could take. And I think the other, worst case scenario that I wanted to mention is just that, Iran is on the cusp of having the ability to break out and develop nuclear weapons. And I think that there are a fair number, maybe even an increasing number of, voices inside of Iran who think that, that it would be a wise decision, that this whole situation exposes the need for a deterrence, and what better deterrence than a nuclear weapon. So I think there are a lot of ways Iran could potentially take this, and the effect that would have on the rest of the region remains to be seen, how the Arab states would respond to Iran breaking out and deciding it wants to go nuclear.
I get it. We're talking with Jamal Abdi, the president of the National Iranian American Council, NIAC. Jamal, we're going to hit a hard break here in about a minute and a half that I can't control. So just FYI, I'm wondering how, what are the domestic politics of this for Iran?
Well, I think that the government of Iran is beleaguered, sort of facing the greatest legitimacy crisis it has had in the existence of the Islamic Republic. They just had an election with record low turnout. And I think that, I don't want to generalize, but I think that for ordinary Iranians, there's really this, there's a fear of war, but there's also a sense of the economy is in such peril. Everyday life is just increasingly difficult. And there's not a desire for a big war to break out. And there's not I think there are some who think there will not be a rally around the flag effect because of the disenchantment with the government. But I think some of the signs that we're seeing is that, in fact, an all-out war probably would actually enable this beleaguered government to really reconsolidate power. And already we're seeing...
I'm sorry, go ahead.
Well, we're seeing a renewed crackdown on the hijab, the enforcement of the hijab, which, folks who are going to Iran right now are saying, wow, most women are not wearing hijab anymore. The state claims this is illegal, but is not enforcing it. And now they're returning to this. And I think returning to some of these, basically using the external crisis to crack down internally and sort of ensure that they've consolidated power. So I really think that is the direction things
we've got really weak mullahs, and we've got really weak Netanyahu, both of them with astonishingly low popularity ratings. And if either country was, arguably fully democratic, somebody else would be running both of them, it seems. These are just going to be, it could be just kind of last-ditch efforts to hang on to power on both sides, right?
I think that's a really astute analysis.
Yeah, okay. Jamal Abdi, the president of the National Iranian American Council. You can check it out, niacouncil.org on the internet. Jamal, thank you so much for dropping by. It's always great talking with you. I always learn something. Thank you.
My pleasure, Tom.
Thank you so much. there's a very thought-provoking and concerning article over at Politico. It's titled "Combustible: Trump's Pivotal Moment with Iran," and points out that Iran is experiencing some considerable internal turmoil. The same is true of both Lebanon and Iraq, which Iran largely controls or has considerable influence over. And that our policy toward Iran has basically, by pulling out of the Iran nuclear deal and reversing the process of improving our relations with that country, we have just wiped out any ability to play any kind of reasonable role in that area. Brett McGurk, who was the special envoy overseeing the coalition to fight ISIS for the Trump administration, said, and I quote, "There's a real risk that over the coming months, Iran does something in the Gulf or elsewhere, and you've had no deliberative process of which the president's been a part to assess courses of action." On the line with us is Jamal Abdi, the president of the National Iranian American Council, NIAC, N-I-A-C. NIAC.org is the website, and you can tweet him at jabdi, J-A-B-D-I, or at NIAC Council, or NIA Council. Jamal, welcome back to the program.
Thanks for having me back, Tom.
Your thoughts on my setup here from this article in Politico?
The situation continues to get more and more dangerous. This, what we saw in Iran last week with protests, the escalating back and forth of threats, this is all predictable. This is all part of the maximum pressure campaign. Iran is under pressure from the United States. There are these massive sanctions in place. There's a near total embargo on Iranian oil, and we are seeing the Iranian government take countermeasures and lashing out. And even with the protests inside the country, I think Mike Pompeo and others in the Trump administration thought this was some kind of victory. I don't think 200 people being killed in the streets is a victory. I don't think that's going to lead to a democracy. I also don't think it's going to lead Iran to capitulate. I think it's actually going to trigger Iran to continue to escalate its own pushback against the United States. So this is a combustible situation that's getting ever more combustible every day that it continues.
I had this conversation with somebody, it might have been you, sometime in the last 4 or 5 months, just wondering out loud, has there ever been a time where severe sanctions have actually altered the behavior of a government? Severe sanctions being imposed by the United States. It certainly didn't change Cuba. To the best of my knowledge, it hasn't changed Iran's behavior. If anything, it's hardened it. Our sanctions against Iraq killed 500,000 Iraqi kids, because we wouldn't provide them with chlorine to chlorinate their water. But, Saddam Hussein didn't change anything. I mean, it seems to me like this policy that Trump is pursuing is punitive, but is probably not going to have the result that he claims he wants, which is, to bring Iran into, into some form of democratic governance. Your thoughts?
No, yeah, you're absolutely right. Sanctions that are aimed at regime change have not worked. I mean, you may be able to collapse an economy, but I don't think there has been any instance
like we're doing with Venezuela.
Like we're doing with Venezuela, like we've tried to do with all the examples that you mentioned. Sanctions, far be it from me to advocate for sanctions, but the idea is you have a specific goal that you want. You want party X to do Y, and you're going to impose sanctions with the promise that they'll be lifted if that party actually does what you want them to do. In this case, Iran actually did what we wanted them to do with the nuclear program and the nuclear deal, and we pulled back on those we pulled back on the relief. So now we're issuing these sanctions. It's unclear what Iran would have to do to get out of the sanctions. There's no pathway out of it, and even if they do that, I don't think inside Iran anybody believes that the U.S. will actually make good on its word. So like with Iraq, where we essentially, the United States essentially said, our policy is regime change. There's nothing Saddam can do to get out of these sanctions, but we're going to sanction him. Well, we saw what that did to Iraq. We saw how it destroyed Iraqi society. We saw the humanitarian impact. We saw the way that it actually enriched the authoritarian rulers of Iraq. And now we're saying the same thing with Iran. And, it's hard to, it's sort of, the dog that caught the car. Okay, now you have these protests inside of Iran. Now what? What's the idea here? How does this actually get better?
Right. Yeah, and I'm not seeing an answer to that question. To what extent is Iran embedded in the political and economic infrastructure of Iraq and Lebanon, and to what extent might those relationships represent the probability or possibility of any kind of conflict with Iran turning into a regional conflict that could turn into a regional conflagration?
Yeah, I think that's the nightmare scenario that I think is getting more and more likely. I mean, Iran obviously has a lot of power inside of Iraq, both with the political leadership as well as the security infrastructure, and the Iranian security forces being embedded there, or advising, or having these militia groups inside of Iraq. So Iran exercises a lot of power there, and obviously there is protests now inside of Iraq against really the economic conditions, but Iran is taking a lot of the blame for that. And then with Lebanon, Iran's support of Hezbollah gives it, serious influence. Hezbollah is its own actor. It's not necessarily a proxy of Iran, but it is a client of Iran. And I think, the really simple way to view the Middle East is right now it's a contest between Iran on one side, along with these, whether they're proxy groups or the political leadership in the case of Iraq, or an insurgency in the case of Yemen, against the U.S. and its allies, Saudi Arabia, Israel, some of the Gulf states. And we are actually seeing this problem between, this proxy war between the two parties, whereas in 2015, the hope was you put out the nuclear fire. You take that off the table, and then you actually enable some opportunities to find resolutions to these other issues. Actually get Iran and Saudi Arabia to start talking to one another. Eventually get Iran and Israel to start talking to one another. By abandoning the nuclear deal, we're now hardening those divides, and there's no clear end goal in sight other than we win, Iran loses. And if that's going to be the case, then we're going to have to be prepared for this total conflagration and a really costly either this simmering, proxy war, or an all-out, real war between the two sides.
Yeah, and Israel has been making basically peace, and peace is not literally, but is working basically with some of the Sunni states against Iran, and some of and now Iraq and Lebanon and Yemen, the basically Shia states. And, here we've got this, 800-year-old conflict that is, on the verge of breaking out. During the Obama administration, the explicit goal was to bring peace to the entire region and to try and bring people together. Do you know that if there is any Middle Eastern policy that can be defined that has come out of the Trump administration? Have they said out loud, this is our policy, even if they're not following it? I mean, is there any sense of a policy at all? Has Mike Pompeo said anything?
I think the Trump administration has become a playground for ideologues to experiment with the fantasies that they've had for many years.
Or to act out what Fox News tells them to do, it seems.
Well, there's the ideological bend of a lot of these advisors who I don't think are operating in any sort of concerted way, so you don't have a real U.S. policy. And then you have, more so than I think any other point in history, personal political ambitions defining what is happening in the region. So, of course, Israel and the way that Israel, the role it plays in U.S. politics has always been, an outsized role. But now you have a president who is just giving things away to Israel explicitly for his reelection, explicitly to try to build support among evangelical and, pro-Israel voters. And I think that sort of that naked politicization, it's also the case inside of Israel with what Netanyahu is doing, facing this indictment and what he may do to try to save his own political skin. So there's no real policy in place other than protecting your own skin if you're Donald Trump or you're Benjamin Netanyahu or you're one of the other players in the region.
Yeah. Our old buddy Jamal Abdi, he is the president of the National Iranian American Council, NIAC, NIAC.org, and you can tweet him at NIA Council or J Abdi, ABDI. Jamal, welcome back to the program.
Thanks for having me back.
I think in the period of time from the last time we talked until now, Iran has broken through the limit on that was part of the agreement that they had with us and France, Germany, UK, China, and Russia. This takes them nowhere close to sufficiently enriched uranium to build a bomb. I think that's in the 90% category. But it is, and they're floating around 20, 30%. I'm not sure exactly where the enrichment is, but or maybe it's even far lower than that. If you know, please fill us in. But do you see this as a negotiating strategy? Is this a way of trying to get Europe back on board? Is this I mean, what is the logic here? What is going on?
Yeah. So first, what Iran is doing. So Iran has surpassed the limit on the amount of this low enriched uranium that it has stockpiled.
Oh, I see.
And
okay.
yeah, so this is probably in terms of the range of escalatory steps that Iran can take to exceed some of the limits and restrictions under the nuclear deal. This is near the bottom of the list. Although, if Iran does start to amass, an enormous stockpile, that would give them more options to, potentially enrich that to a higher level and have enough for a nuclear weapon, if they decide to go in that direction. But I think what Iran is doing is really trying to take a very measured escalatory approach to provide many different sort of checkpoints for off-ramps from this cycle of escalation. And what they've threatened to do next, what the President Rouhani said that Iran was going to begin doing this Sunday, is to actually begin enriching at a purer level, so a higher level of enrichment. Currently, they're at 3.5%, which is the level that you would want for most civilian purposes. In the past, Iran has enriched all the way up to 20%. This is pre-nuclear deal, and that was, by Iran's telling, that was for the Tehran research reactor. It's for medical isotopes and things of that nature. But it does get you closer to the 90% purity level, which is weapons grade. And so that's the next step that is potentially coming. Now, Iran's strategy here, for the first half of the Trump administration, Iran really kind of sat on its hands, at least as far as the nuclear deal is concerned. Iran was never getting the sanctions relief that was promised. There were all kinds of issues with that. And when Trump took office, most private businesses and banks said, okay, this deal is probably too risky for us to really take advantage of the sanctions relief. And so then when Trump killed the deal, it got even worse. And so Iran's economy has been suffering. They are not getting the relief that was promised. It has punished all the politicians inside of Iran who argued for this deal. And what Iran did was they practiced this policy of strategic patience. And the idea was, we're going to stay with the deal. We're not going to upset Europe and the other parties to the deal. We're going to make it very clear that the United States now is the rogue state that's not acting as a normal country, and we're going to go on with our commitments. At some point in the last month or so, clearly Iran has decided to pivot and has realized that, at least what they say is they need to meet pressure with pressure. They cannot sit on their hands and allow really the Trump administration to get all the benefits of the nuclear deal and put Iran's nuclear program in this box, while continuing to sanction Iran and not actually give what was promised. So they have pivoted to this pressure for pressure policy, and I think you see that with at least the threats of a more aggressive military posture and potentially the shooting down of the drone a couple of weeks ago. So there are escalatory threats there. And then on the nuclear deal itself, there are these escalations. And this is, I think, the first. And again, I think what does Iran really want out of this? Well, many think that it is to put pressure on Europe to do more, to step up and actually challenge the United States and actually, kind of put their money where their mouth is to protect European companies from sanctions, to allow this trade and investment to go forward. I'm not quite so sure. I think that Iran realizes that if the United States is not at least bought in, it's going to be very difficult for the Iranian economy to recover. And so I think that bigger picture, Iran is probably willing to negotiate with the United States even under Trump, but they want the United States to essentially suspend their pressure campaign and provide some breathing room so that the talks can go on.
And they need some respect. China announced, I believe, I've only seen one story on this morning, but China has announced in the last, apparently the last couple of days, that they're rolling out their version of an alternative to the SWIFT system, which is the settlement system where companies and countries, as money is flowing across borders, there's basically this kind of central clearinghouse, and it's mostly done in dollars, which is one of the reasons the dollar is the reserve currency of the world, in addition to oil. And please correct me if I'm getting any of this wrong, because I'm no expert on this stuff. And the EU apparently is putting together some variation on a way to have international settlements of funds that don't involve dollars. Conceivably, could any of that be a way for European countries in particular? And I'm guessing Iran has business with China. I don't know if that's been affected or not. But getting around the American sanctions, where Trump is basically threatening European countries that do business in the United States or with U.S. companies, that they're going to get cut off if they do business with Iran, and the weapon he's been using is the fact that everything's denominated in dollars. Or is that just way out there or way down the road?
I think that's potentially something that could work in the near term, but is probably a longer-term approach. The Europeans promised this mechanism where trade could actually occur, where Iran would be able to sell its oil and have basically a way to avoid touching the U.S. financial system. And I think Europe has been unwilling to really test that proposition. They finally got this channel online, but for now it is only allowing trade in goods that are not sanctioned by the United States. So Europe has still really not kind of taken big risks here. But they have started, and it's baby steps. And I think what the Iranians have seen is that, okay, by escalating, they've actually gotten Europe to be a little bit more bold with those steps. But I think the bigger picture here, it's almost ironic, if you kind of take a literal reading of what the Islamic Revolution was about and what Khomeini was saying, what Khamenei says today about this, this contest with the United States to kind of take on the imperial power and to break the hegemony of the United States. And ironically, the sanctions policies that the U.S. has adopted are really actually doing that for Iran, in that the U.S. has had this monopoly over the financial system because it's viewed as this kind of benevolent dictator as far as the world financial system is concerned. Now you have the U.S. kind of abusing that power and saying, okay, if you want to be a part of the financial system, you have to abide by all these rules, even if we signed on to an agreement and now we're backing out, but you have to abide by the sanctions. And so the response that the Chinese are taking and what the Europeans are considering is, okay, how do we maintain our sovereignty to be able to set our own policies if the United States has the last word? And so they're beginning to devise ways to eliminate the U.S. monopoly and end American hegemony over the financial system and its ability to impose these sanctions. So I think longer term, this is, the Trump administration is expending so much capital and really not getting anything for it. And it's this, it's this race to, okay, is Iran's economy going to collapse first, or are the Americans going to relent, or is Europe going to be able to find a way out of this? And if something doesn't happen, I think ultimately you will have this military conflict, or you will have the U.S. just saying, okay, Iran has broken out of the deal, we no longer have inspectors there, but there's nothing we can do about it.
On the line with us is Jamal Abdi. He is lost my paper here. He is the president of the National Iranian American Council, NIAC. NIAC.org is the website. You can tweet him at jabdi, A-B-D-I. Jamal, welcome back to the program.
Hi, Tom.
Thank you for joining us again. I'm curious your thoughts on what is going on. I just Sean, in fact, just tracked this down. Mr. Soleimani. Apparently, last year when Donald Trump was rage tweeting at Iran, he tweeted back. He responded saying, it's my duty to respond to your threats. Talk to me, not to the president. It is not in our president's dignity to respond to you. We are near you where you can't even imagine. Come, we are ready. If you begin the war, we will end the war. You know that this war will destroy all that you possess. Your thoughts?
Well, earlier this week, actually the day before yesterday, the supreme leader of Iran tweeted at Trump for the first time, and tweeted something along the lines of, in response to a Trump threat against Iran, said you can't do anything and you are illogical, and some other insult. And a lot of people on Twitter thought, wow, this is the closest thing we've seen to direct diplomacy between Trump or any U.S. president and the supreme leader of Iran. I can't help but, this sounds crazy, but I can't help but think that by doing that, the supreme leader may have helped Trump cross over from a position where he was being somewhat conservative in his willingness to engage in kinetic action against Iran into finally, actually greenlighting this strike against Soleimani that, compared to some of the past strikes that Trump has, abandoned, is so disproportionate and so clearly is going to lead to an escalatory cycle that I really can't understand why else Trump would do this now.
So you think he got provoked by or you think it's a possibility that Trump was provoked by a tweet that is by and large not even being reported on by anybody, that and struck out because of that, because he felt humiliated or harassed or called out?
We know that the people around Trump, like Mike Pompeo, like some of the lobby groups that are close to him, like the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, they view 2020 as their last best chance to get the war with Iran that they have wanted for 2 decades now, at least, and have been pressuring and pushing and trying to goad Trump into taking more and more provocative actions. And Trump has been very provocative on the economic sanctions front, but you'll remember, months ago came within 10 minutes of bombing Iran and actually pulled back from the brink because he thought, well, this is going to end up killing potentially as many as 50 Iranians, and this is disproportionate. And really, I think he realized this is going to expose the lie of the Trump presidency as an isolationist one, or an anti-war presidency, because it's going to drag us into a war. What has changed since then that would cause him to take this extraordinary step? And I don't think it's the people around him that have changed. I think it's Trump himself has finally decided to take this reckless action.
That's remarkable. We're talking to Jamal Abdi, the president of the National Iranian American Council. NIAC.org is the website. It looks to me, this is my kind of back of the matchbook analysis, that a new set of alliances are emerging and solidifying right before us. It has been going on for a year or two. And that if we were to see a polar world, like we saw with World War II, with allies and Axis, basically, two groups of allied countries going after each other, that it might be on one side Iran, Syria, Russia, and China, and perhaps some of the other more Shia-associated countries in that region. And then on the other side, Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Israel, the United States, and perhaps much of Europe, fighting it out to the death. I mean, that's a World War III scenario based on a World War I kind of assumption that in fact, I tweeted last night at 8 o'clock, when this first happened, I tweeted, Trump just assassinated Archduke Ferdinand. This is not going to end well. What do you think of all that?
I think it's where this has been heading for a while. Now, I think that where the analogy breaks down is, at least for now, that the Europeans are not with Trump on his Iran strategy. And this latest action was not coordinated with the Europeans. They just got phone calls today from Mike Pompeo that this had happened.
Right. Great Britain is freaked out. Yeah.
Yeah. And then on the other hand, the Russians and the Chinese, unlike the United States, they talk to everybody in the region. So they're not bound to one side or the other. Whereas the U.S., we are completely boxed in we can only deal with the Saudis and the Israelis and the UAE, whereas Putin is talking to Turkey and Iran and Syria and Saudi Arabia and Israel. So I don't know if it's gonna fall on such clean lines. Really, what this looks like is the U.S. isolated from its traditional partners, all in with Israel and the Saudis, and then some of the U.S.'s supposed foes in Russia and China, and then smaller states like Iran, having much stronger relationships with who would constitute the coalition of the willing if this actually became
even with Europe
exchange.
That's actually a very hopeful thing. I mean, the terrible thing for the United States to be basically cut out of everything, but that's the direction Trump has been taking us ever since he was sworn into office. But that at least is not a world war scenario. That's more of a United States gets isolated and cut off from everybody, and the market crashes, and we go to hell in a handbasket scenario kind of thing.
Yeah, the resolve of the Europeans has clearly been tested, and while rhetorically they have been against what the U.S. has been doing, there hasn't been a lot of bite to their bark, and so a lot of people expected, Iran is supposed to take its next step to put pressure on the United States for abandoning the nuclear deal. Iran was planning to take its next step to breach some of its commitments on the nuclear program January 6th. And we don't know what those steps were going to be, but as a result, the Europeans were supposedly going to trigger a dispute mechanism within the Iran deal and potentially begin holding Iran accountable in the same way the United States was. So there is a chance that Europe is beginning to not just hedge, but surrender to the United States and Trump. I don't know if this now changes that and actually changes European calculations, because the threat of war is now very imminent, and taking such actions could actually force the Europeans' hand to be aligned with the United States on any such action.
Well, and in Hungary, you've got Fidesz and Orban, doing a nationalist chest-thumping thing, and much of that is happening in Poland as well, kind of pulling Europe away from, trying to pull them in a more authoritarian direction and away from multilateralism. And then you've got in Turkey, you've got Erdogan, who's all over the map, in addition to calling up Trump one day and saying, "Get your damn troops out of Syria," and Trump says, "Sir, yes, sir," and tweets it before he's even discussed it with the Joint Chiefs. It seems like all the old rules are gone.
There's a massive shift happening, and this is potentially the sort of world historic event in a chain of events. The election of these nationalist leaders, culminating in Donald Trump becoming the leader of the United States, and now these shifting alliances, and the one parallel that I think is pretty easy to make is to that of 1914 and how that did really establish these lines and create this new world order. So I think we, as many have said, we are now in uncharted territory, and this could be what sets off a set of really bad events to come.
We're talking with Jamal Abdi, the president of the National Iranian American Council. What should Americans be doing right now, in your opinion? I mean, I've been saying, call Congress, 202-225-3121, and tell them that the president just acted outside of the powers he has with the AUMF, the 9/11 authorization for military force, and to stop all this right now. But do you have suggestions beyond that?
Congress caved. Democrats in Congress caved, and there was legislation that was actually included in the defense bill, thanks to Ro Khanna and Chris Murphy and Tim Kaine and Matt Gaetz, a Republican from Florida, that would have stated clearly Trump does not have the authorization for war with Iran, and would have really put a legal check against this action that was just taken. And the Democrats ended up allowing that to be stripped out of the final bill that was sent to the president. So I think this is now a wake-up call. This is almost an I told you so moment where we need to see them step up. They are, potentially the last institutional check we have against this president, taking us into this war. If Congress doesn't get the message, people need to turn out and get into this, go out into the streets and, make their voices heard, because we're now in this window where Iran hasn't retaliated yet, and it needs to be made very clear this is Trump's doing. Trump started this. He abandoned the deal. He assassinated Soleimani. This was preventable, and this is not a situation where it's a justifiable retribution. Once Iran retaliates, the politics will change around this. And if we don't have leaders who come out now saying this was wrong and we need to de-escalate, we're not going to have them after the retaliation and the drums of war start beating and overshadowing all the other conversations. So we just need pressure on all of those leaders and 2020 candidates to come out now unequivocally against this action and against escalation towards Iran.
Right, because the retaliation will be viewed the same way, essentially, I suppose 9/11, it may be dramatically less than that or possibly more, but it will be the thing that will galvanize Americans against Iran.
Right. And we now have an opportunity to expose who is to blame for this before it happens. And, hopefully it doesn't happen, and I think that really falls to the international community.
Right.
But, the other thing people can do is, I think it's more imperative than ever, Donald Trump has to be defeated.
Could Trump's Iranian sanctions and his bellicose rhetoric and everything else, but the actual actions now he's taking against Iran, lead to World War III? Could it spread into a regional or even a worldwide conflict? Dr. Trita Parsi drops by and talks about that with us today. Check it out. Leave your comments, ding the bell, and subscribe to our channel. On the line with us is Dr. Trita Parsi. It's been a while since we've talked. He's a professor at Georgetown University, author most recently of Losing an Enemy, Obama, Iran, and the Triumph of Diplomacy. Trita Parsi, TRITAPARSI.com is the website. You can tweet him at TParsi. Dr. Parsi, welcome back to the program.
Thank you so much for having me.
I am looking at what's going on with the situation with Iran and John Bolton and Donald Trump and the Trump administration. And two things pop out at me, and I know that you've written about these, and I'm curious if there are, more than just these two that concern you. The first is the probability that by increasing sanctions and making things worse for the Iranian people, that rather than bringing down the mullahs, if they're successful in their internal media strategy at convincing people that the United States is punishing them rather than their own leadership, it'll solidify their role, and the threats of war will do that as well. And then the second is that if we cut off all these oil exports from Iran, then Iran has said in the past, if you do this, we're not going to let any oil go out of past the Straits of Hormuz. And if that's the case, then we're in war with Iran, are we not?
Absolutely. I mean, the Iranians have been making this threat in the past that they would close the Strait of Hormuz if they cannot export their oil. Either everyone can export their oil or no one can. And I think there were good reasons to not take that too seriously, because at that point, when they were exporting their oil, if they were to do so, they would harm themselves immensely. But we're now, for the first time, looking at a scenario in which they may actually not be able to export their oil because of Trump's measure. And as a result, their threat of closing the strait needs to be taken much more seriously. Now, war games in the Pentagon have all shown the Iranians can close it, but they cannot keep it closed for more than 2 weeks because the U.S. military would intervene and would open it up. But that means that the U.S. military would be in direct confrontation with the Iranians in the Persian Gulf, and that means war.
How would that play out, in your opinion?
Well, based on everything we've seen, the Iranians are not going to prepare themselves for war with the U.S. in the manner that Saddam Hussein did. Saddam Hussein had a very strong standing army. A standing army of any other country, doesn't matter how strong it is, does not stand much of a chance against the U.S. The U.S. is standing army. What can be effective against the U.S., and which is what the Iranians have been focusing on for the last 25 years, is asymmetric warfare, in which they would most likely try to inflict as much damage as possible on the U.S. in the very early stages of a war, in which they would choose the battlefield. It wouldn't be the U.S. attacking Iran. The U.S. would do so, but then the Iranians would retaliate throughout the region and not allow the U.S. to have a veto on where the fighting would take place. Now, and their calculations position likely would be to inflict so much damage on the U.S. as possible early on in order to break the U.S.'s fighting spirit, because if there's one thing in which the Iranians likely would be able to have a comparative advantage vis-a-vis the United States, is that they have far less casualty intolerance than what the U.S. does.
Unwillingness to lose soldiers, essentially, or even civilians.
They have a very high tolerance for that, whereas the U.S. has a very low tolerance, particularly mindful of the fact that the public is not on board with this war to begin with.
The American public.
The American public. I mean, they're not in favor of this war. They don't even know that Trump is moving in that direction.
Right.
And in fact, for good reason, many of the people who constitute Trump's base chose him because he spoke out so strongly against the wars and was so critical of the Iraq war.
But if this was to play out in the way that you're describing with asymmetric warfare, the way that the British described George Washington's asymmetric warfare was terrorism. The American soldiers were hiding behind trees and shooting the British who were coming in straight lines. If the news reports in the United States are that this proxy for the Iranians or that proxy or this group or that group, or even the Iranians themselves committed these smaller acts with high levels of casualties, we'll simply call that terrorism, and that would galvanize American public support for an all-out war with Iran, would it not?
Well, the U.S.
And might that be what Trump is planning on, by the way?
I personally don't think so. Let me address what you said earlier on. The U.S. will call it terrorism, or the Trump administration will call it terrorism anyways, because they've already defined the IRGC as a terrorist organization. So they will be...
This is the Iranian military, basically, the exactly. Revolutionary Guard, yeah.
Revolutionary Guards, which is the strongest element of their national military. The administration will use that line. It will probably have some effect early on. But remember, even the Iraq war, at the outset, had 79% approval rating amongst the American public.
Right.
This will not have anywhere near that. And it will have no international support except for Saudi Arabia, UAE, and Israel. So I think the longevity of the American public's favorableness towards the war will be very short. In the case of Iraq, it lasted about a year and a half.
Right.
And then it turned. I think this time around it will turn much quickly because it will never be above 50% to begin with. This is a war that Trump is picking. This is not a case in which there can be question marks as to whether Iran has nuclear weapons or not, as was the case with Iraq. It's very clear they don't have nuclear weapons. They're abiding by a nuclear agreement that everyone else is in favor of as well. So it will be very difficult for them to sell this war, particularly to their own base,
right,
who are actually very much against these regime change wars and these foreign adventures.
But wow. Just kind of gaming this out. If the United States, let's say Iran shuts down the Straits of Hormuz, we attack them or continue to attack them. They attack us in an asymmetric way. We call that terrorism. We go to war against them. Now you've got, a U.S.-Iranian conflict. But as you pointed out, there's the Saudis, there's the Israelis, and the UAE who are all, aggressively opposed to Iran. In fact, the Saudis are, one of their claims for the reason why they're bombing the crap out of Yemen right now is that the Houthis are aligned with Iran. It seems that if those actors, if Israel, which is a nuclear power, and Saudi Arabia and the UAE were to jump into this thing, you'd have a blown-up regional conflict. You've got Iranian ally in the president of Mr. Bashar al-Assad, the president of Syria. If Syria gets dragged into this thing, I mean, the Russians have an Air Force base and a naval port there. They're going to get in. We could be at war with Russia as a consequence of this. And it seems to me like it wouldn't necessarily be like a classic world war, because Europe is going to be standing on the sidelines going, this ain't our fight. But could this lead us to a war with Russia?
I think we'll have to take several steps before it gets into a war with Russia. But I think the idea that this will be a regional war that would involve many of the other countries and will involve Hezbollah and other actors is very likely. Because if there actually comes to a real military confrontation, the Iranian strategy is going to enlarge the war. it's going to be to enlarge the war, because that's where they most likely have a capacity of being able to win the war, not in the sense of defeating the United States militarily, but in the sense of getting the United States to give up on the war.
Right. Giving us enough of a bloody nose that we pull out like we did in Vietnam. What about the Trump policy? So number one, it appears that the Trump policy is trying to drive us into a war. I personally believe that Donald Trump is doing that for the same reason that in 2010, when Barack Obama was president, and at the beginning of the cycle for the 2012 election, Donald Trump tweeted out, expect Obama, I'm paraphrasing from memory, expect Obama to start a war somewhere soon because, there's an election coming. So Donald Trump clearly knows that presidents during time of war are more easily reelected. This was something George W. Bush told his biographer in 1999, that if he got elected president, he was going to have a war with Iraq, and he was going to make sure it lasted longer than his daddy's war did so he'd get reelected. And he did. It seems to me that Trump is trying to do this as part of an election strategy. I'd love to get your thoughts on that. Well, let's just stop right there. What are your thoughts on that?
I personally, and this is my impression, I can't say that I have an insider information on this, but I actually don't think Trump himself actually wants a war. I think he is being fooled into thinking that this is an effective negotiating strategy.
But people like Bolton wants a war, doesn't he? I mean, Bolton's been cheerleading wars for decades.
Exactly. So Trump himself doesn't want it, I think. He thinks this will bring him leverage for a negotiation in which the Iranians capitulate. But Bolton, Pompeo, and Brian Hook and others in the administration, the people that Trump has surrounded himself with, they do want a war. And they realize that the sanctions path and the escalation path will get them a war. It will not get them a negotiation.
Wow.
And this is where they're essentially tricking Trump into believing this, and he's not probably a terribly difficult person to trick.
Yeah.
I don't think he calculates that this will be good for his re-election. Remember, when he was saying that back in 2010 was before he ran his own campaign, and he ran his campaign very much against the forever wars.
Yeah.
And he knows that he has a lot of support in the public when he says those things, when he's critical of Iraq.
Trita,
that doesn't mean that he may not change his mind and actually try to play that card. It could very well happen.
Yeah, we have just a little less than a minute before we're going to hit a hard break here. To what extent do you think it's possible that Trump might back away from that? I mean, how does this play out if Trump and his advisors are at odds on this?
In Syria, we saw that once he kind of got suspicious of what they were doing, he moved quickly and said, we're going to withdraw Syria. But then we also saw that Pompeo and Bolton were successful in walking that back. I mean, that's part of the problem that exists right now, that there's a president that has instincts that are suspicious of war, suspicious of regime change, but he has surrounded himself with neoconservative advisors who are just taking advantage of him and who are constantly pushing for much, much more bellicose policies under his nose.
Yeah, this is a remarkable issue that is not getting anything close to the attention that it should be in the American press. It just shocks me that it's not. This should be a scandal, says a New York Times columnist. This is pretty amazing. Acting Under Secretary of State Darren Beattie wants to build a blacklist of people who should be frozen out or even targeted by the administration as enemies. Now, who is Acting Under Secretary of State Darren Beattie? Well, he's the guy who a couple months ago posted on X, competent white men must be in charge if you want things to work. He's the guy who in 2018 left the Trump administration when CNN revealed that he had attended a conference featuring prominent white nationalists. He worked for Matt Gaetz the following year, 2019, and said that FBI agents were in the crowd as provocateurs on January 6th. And now he is demanding that all staff emails and other records with or about a host of individuals and organizations that track or write about foreign disinformation and all staff communications that merely reference Trump or people in his orbit like Alex Jones, Glenn Greenwald, and Robert F. Kennedy Jr. must be turned over to him. In addition, he's requesting a search of communications for keywords including Pepe the Frog incel, QAnon, Black Lives Matter, Great Replacement Theory, far right, and infodemic. This is according to the MIT Technology Review. In The Atlantic, Tom Nichols writes, unfortunately, Trump's mania for loyalty above all else almost guarantees that Beatty's disgraceful attempt. Keep in mind, this is the guy who says we need white men in charge for things to work. He is now the acting Undersecretary of State. Nichols writes, unfortunately, Trump's mania for loyalty above all else also guarantees that Beatty's disgraceful attempt will not be the last such effort at Soviet-style political policing in the United States government. Speaking of the United States government, last night Pete Hegseth went on what I'm guessing was a drunk Twitter rampage. Now, keep in mind, the Secretary of Defense runs the military, but the Secretary of Defense does not run U.S. foreign policy. The Secretary of Defense has to do what the president tells him or what Congress tells him if Congress declares war. Then his job begins. But his job and his job description do not include things like threatening other countries or making statements or taking postures relative to U.S. foreign policy and particularly U.S. war policy. So with that in mind, that Hegseth's only job should be to say, yes, sir, I will deploy the Navy to Yemen, or yes, sir, I will deploy the Air Force to Taiwan, or, following orders, essentially. That he has no role, none, in defining American foreign policy or in expressing American foreign policy to other governments. That's the job of the State Department. That's the job of the president. Secretary of Defense, his job is to run the Pentagon, not to do these things. Listen to this. This is what he posted. I'm telling you, he's drinking again. This is what he posted last night on Twitter. Quote, message to Iran. We see your lethal support to the Houthis. We know exactly what you're doing. You know very well what the U.S. military is capable of, and you were warned. You will pay the consequence at the time and place of our choosing. End quote. This is insane. I mean, no Secretary of Defense in the history of America has ever talked like this to a foreign country. Any kind of communication like that, any kind of threat like that, has to come from either the President or the Secretary of State. And it has to be in a formal statement, like from the press, from the press room, not as a drunken 2 a.m. tweet. Actually, I don't know what time he tweeted it, but I mean, even this, this will blow your mind. Thomas Massey, the right-wing crackpot from Kentucky. He's hardcore MAGA. He's the guy who every year at Christmas posts on Twitter pictures of him and his wife and their 4 sons, as I recall, all holding AR-15s, including the little kids. Right? I mean, he's really into guns. He's really into MAGA. He's really into being a right-wing Republican. Thomas Massey said about this drunken tweet by Pete Hegseth, quote, I support this administration, but the Secretary of Defense doesn't have the constitutional authority to declare war on a sovereign country. A planned military attack on Iran is an act of war, requires a vote of Congress, according to the U.S. Constitution. Could the Houthi Yemeni strike on Saudi Arabia, if it's handled wrong by this administration, lead us to World War III and possibly even a nuclear conflagration? Check it out. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel, ding the bell, leave your comments, and share our story, our channel and our show with your friends. I wanted to get into the issue of the attack on Saudi Arabia's oil facilities over the weekend. On the line with us is the president of the National Iranian American Council, NIAC, N-I-A-C, Jamal Abdi. NIAC.org, NIAC.org is the website, and you can tweet them at NIA Council, or Jamal is J-A-B-D-I on Twitter. Jamal, welcome back to the program.
Glad to be here, Tom.
So give us a summary, basically, of what we know at this point. I mean, we've got this this headline from the Washington Post here. The Saudi oil attacks are signs of Trump's Mideast fiasco. This is Max Boot's place. And he says basically Trump's Middle East policy has failed. At the root of the problem is Trump's decision to outsource Middle East leadership to Israel and Saudi Arabia. In your opinion, is that really at the core of this? I mean, first of all, what happened and what do we make of it?
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack. What happened was there was a attack on on two Saudi facilities that will significantly disrupt the flow of oil. It's already having a pretty significant impact on those markets, and the Houthis of Yemen, who are currently involved in a civil war, and which, Saudi, with the support of the United States, has been bombing and has helped create the world's greatest humanitarian disaster. The Houthis claimed credit for it. But the United States, in Mike Pompeo, was quick to come out and say, no, this was not the Houthis. This strike was not launched from Yemen. It was launched by Iran, potentially from either Iraq or Iran. So that's the, if you can call it a fact pattern, I hate to use that word when it comes to Mike Pompeo, that's where we're at. I think at the risk of, identifying with Max Boot,
yeah,
I think that's the right analysis.
Yeah, if I could ask, I mean, isn't typically there's so much surveillance. There's satellite surveillance. There's air traffic control surveillance. There's all kinds of radar. Saudi Arabia has some very, very sophisticated systems that have been provided by the United States. And we should add, by the way, that the bombs being dropped on the Houthis that have now led to the world's greatest humanitarian crisis, millions of people suffering from malnutrition, on the edge of starvation. The Saudis are bombing the port through which the food comes into the country of Yemen, among other things, that those bombs all have "Made in the USA" printed on them. So, and nobody is suggesting, to the best of my knowledge, that the United States is directly bombing Yemen, although we have been assisting the Saudis in an assistance that I find pretty horrific. But, I mean, isn't there enough, radar surveillance that if it's true that these drones or these missiles, whichever they are, apparently drones, were launched from either Iraq or Iran, that the Saudis would be able to say, here's the documentary evidence, here's the video or the screenshot or whatever of our radar. You can see it. You can see where it came from. I mean, if it was the case, wouldn't it take them like 10 minutes to trot that out?
I don't know if it would take 10 minutes. I don't know how sophisticated the attack was. Supposedly it was 10 drones that were flown in. I think, though, what you're putting your finger on is there should be some evidence that is brought forward beyond just our Secretary of State saying Iran has a motive, and so we think it's Iran. I mean, This is the same guy who says Iran was behind 9/11. He'll say anything. But
Pompeo said that?
Instead of going and making this case, we've seen nothing.
Pompeo said Iran was behind 9/11?
Yeah, Pompeo has attempted to link Iran with al-Qaeda because the authorization for war is for war against al-Qaeda after 9/11. So he declassified a bunch of materials, shared them with this hawkish organization to try to promote while he was at CIA. This is something very close to him.
Wow. So how is this playing within Iran? I know that they've come out and said, no, we didn't do this. But beyond that.
Iran is denying any involvement. I do think that, Iran has provided support for the Houthis. So there's probably a good chance that there are some Iranian fingerprints on this. But the notion that Iran has command and control over the Houthis or any other group that might have been involved with this, I think is a little bit gray. Right. And I do, we talk about the humanitarian disaster in Yemen. There's also the fact that Iran is under these massive sanctions from the U.S. Iran is not able to export its own oil. And so, there's probably a motive for Iran to push back. But there's also this question of, well, the Iranians are actually open to negotiations. There was talk of a potential meeting between Trump and Rouhani. And I think the Iranians really wanted to see some movement on the sanctions issue before they could green light such a meeting, and now that seems to be completely off the table.
Which is another strong argument for the fact, for arguing that Iran had nothing to do with this. They might have sold this weaponry to Yemen on the assumption that Yemen would use it to defend itself against the Saudis locally, but that had they known that this was going to be the outcome, they wouldn't have done it at this point in time. Is that reasonable?
Yeah, I think that's definitely a reasonable explanation.
The other thing that I find fascinating is that a couple of days ago, Trump, or yesterday, early on, let's say early after this happened, Trump was all over this is all Iran's fault, and then suddenly he started dialing it back and started talking out loud about, or tweeting about, how America is now an oil exporting country, and it hit me. Maybe Trump got a phone call from some of the local, oil barons in the United States saying, this really isn't a bad thing for us. The price of oil just went up 15, 20 bucks a barrel. We're going to make a hell of a lot more money. Why don't you just back off and just let us make our money here? What do you think of that?
Well, I think the problem is that Trump is really motivated to have a strong economy. And if this shock has a negative value on the economy and helps to trigger a recession in an election year, that's a big problem for Trump. Right. So I think he's juggling a series of interests that include wanting to look like a deal maker, wanting to not look like a warmonger, but to look tough, the outsourcing of foreign policy in the Middle East to Saudi and the Israelis, and then the desire to be reelected and have a strong economy. And I don't think he's up to the task of juggling all these things. Yeah, I think to say the very least. So we're talking with Jerome Abdi, the president of the National Iranian American Council, NIAC.org. So for Americans who are calling their members of Congress and saying, please do or don't do something, for those of us who are concerned about the future of U.S. foreign policy in the region, what do you think is the most useful response to all of this? It's really important that there's a political firewall against military action. And I think that without a strong response from the grassroots, as well as, in the media, there's going to be this growing acceptance by sort of the national security class in Washington that the U.S. has to respond. There were people who are often associated with the reasonable side of the debate who, the last time there was this potential flare-up, they supported U.S. strikes without really understanding the implications and the fact that that would likely lead to this unraveling that could lead to an all-out regional war. So I really think, for people at home, it is really important to call both your representative as well as your two senators and ask them to come out on the record and push back against any unauthorized war. And they can do that now, and they're not doing it. Congressman Mark Pocan was on our program today for an hour taking calls from listeners. He's the co-chair of the Congressional Progressive Caucus. And there were some interesting moments. Here's one. Check it out. Share it with your friends. Ding the bell. Leave a comment. And please subscribe to our channel if you find it useful. And I'm just wondering, what do you think? Where do you think that this thing with Iran is going to go? Does this concern you as much as it does me?
Well, absolutely. Especially the president seems to be trying to act as if it's other people in his cabinet that are promoting this, which I'm sure they are. But every action the president's taken has been to put us closer to involvement with Iran, starting with breaking the Iranian agreement that many of us, whipped and worked hard to pass in Congress. And, then you watch the president, I think on Friday or somewhere around there, say, oh, he doesn't want to go to war. It's his people. He's trying to stay out of it. And then he tweets out yesterday, essentially, that he'll wipe Iran off the planet. I'm paraphrasing only slightly. So this is really unstable, and some people hypothesize that it's awful hard to do any impeachment proceedings if you're involved in a war, and we're really concerned. So we do have a briefing, a classified briefing, either Tuesday or Wednesday. I believe it's tomorrow, and hopefully we'll have a very good, frank conversation. But clearly the administration is up to no good right now, in my opinion. Yeah, yeah.
It seems to me, my concern is that Bolton and Pompeo are both explicitly war hawks. I mean, they were gung-ho for the Iraq war, no apologies, gung-ho for the Afghanistan war. They've been basically gung-ho for any war that they can get involved in. And it seems like they've been very successful at maneuvering Trump into positions where he may unwillingly end up with a war on his hands. I mean, is it possible that he is being that easily manipulated by these guys?
Well, I think they clearly are very hawkish and would have no problem going to war for lots of different reasons. For Donald Trump, I find him nearly impossible to predict because he knows so little about the job that he has. When it comes to trade, he won Wisconsin and Michigan and I think Pennsylvania because he talked about bringing American jobs back. He talked tough on trade. And then now he's done all these random tariffs and they've actually hurt people far more back home. And he hasn't brought jobs back home. He doesn't understand it. When it comes to war, he talked about bringing troops home. And yet time after time, he lets them still ultimately make the call. But in this case, I actually, I wish I didn't believe this, but I do believe that he thinks something like that would be an awful convenient way to ensure that you don't start perhaps an impeachment process, because it's awful hard to impeach a president during a time of war.
We've been talking about Iran and what do you think is going to happen here. As you heard from my conversation with Trita Parsi, I'm very concerned about this. One of the things that concerns me the most, now that we know how clearly Dick Cheney and George W. Bush lied to us about weapons of mass destruction in Iraq in order to have a war that George W. Bush and Dick Cheney thought would carry them to victory in the 2004 election, and in fact did. Now that we know that they lied to us about this, Seymour Hersh, the iconic New York Times reporter, the guy who has broken all kinds of major national security stories for the New York Times, hasn't worked for the New York Times for probably a decade or so, but he's still one of America's great investigative journalists. At an event that I believe was held by the Center for American Progress some years ago. Oh, Campus Press Journalism. Thank you, Nate. Had this to say. Check this out.
There was a dozen ideas proffered how to trigger a war. The one that interested me the most was, why don't we in our shipyard build 4 or 5 Iranian boats that look like Iranian PT boats, put Navy SEALs on them with a lot of arms, and the next time one of our boats goes through the Straits of Hormuz, start a shoot-up. Might cost some lives. One of the things they learned in the incident was the American public, if you get the right incident, the American public will support, bang, bang, kiss, kiss, we're into it. Look, is it high school? Yeah. Are we playing high school with, 5,000 nuclear warheads in our arsenal? Yeah, we are. We're playing, who's the first guy to run off the highway with us in Iran.
Yeah, this is pretty, with us in Iran. This is pretty amazing stuff. And keep in mind what he's reporting here, and to the best of my knowledge, this has been backed up, or at least it hasn't been contradicted, is that Dick Cheney sat around in the White House and said, hey, let's have a war with Iran now. Right, and the way to do it is to build some boats that look like Iranian Navy boats and start that. This, I think, is one of the most consequential stories that's getting almost no coverage whatsoever. You'll recall in Vietnam, a little over 2.5 million Vietnamese died, at best estimates, and over 50,000 American soldiers. And we were lied into that war. The Gulf of Tonkin, that attack on the American, I believe it was a destroyer, whatever the ship was. Never happened. It was just made up. It was a pretext for war, to expand the war, that Lyndon Johnson did. I mean, it was a lie. Similarly with Iraq, there were no weapons of mass destruction. We knew there were no weapons of mass destruction. We were the ones who had sold Saddam those weapons of mass destruction in the first place. That was the Iraq Gate scandal in 1988 and what was the year? 1980, no, this was 1990-91, that Bill Barr, as Attorney General, buried. This is what made William Safire so nuts, the famous New York Times columnist who used to do this column called On Language. And the one thing he was crazed about was Bill Barr. He was the Attorney General, and he covered up the sale, the illegal sale of weapons of mass destruction by the Bush administration and the Reagan administration, the first Bush administration, to Saddam Hussein. So we knew what he had, and we knew how out of date it was, and we knew how ineffective and what a waste of time it was. George W. Bush was lying through his teeth, as was Dick Cheney. Dick Cheney was going down to CIA headquarters and hassling people, something that had never been done before. Well, now you've got John Bolton going down to CIA headquarters, and they're trying to gin this up. Meteor Blade's writing over the Daily Kos, after pointing out, that we got lied into two different wars. On Tuesday came the take of Betsy Woodruff and Alan Walmsley at the Daily Beast. They found the assertion that Iran was preparing to take action. The whole point that Bolton made and that the Trump administration is making is we're sending this warship into the Persian Gulf off the coast of Iran because we understand they're about to attack us or American interests or American allies. They found, this is Woodruff and Ransley, they found that the assertion that Iran was preparing to take action against the United States was, excuse the expression, trumped up. In other words, it ain't happening. There is no evidence of this. If there was, it would be on the front page of the New York Times. They are lying to us to set us up for Donald Trump's re-election war. You will recall that Donald Trump over and over and over again, back when Barack Obama was president, kept pointing out, in his opinion, that the best way to win re-election for a sitting president is to have a war. On November 29th, 2011, in anticipation of the 2012 elections, Donald Trump tweeted, quote, "In order to get elected, Barack Obama will start a war with Iran." Then on October 9th, 2012, a couple of weeks later, Donald Trump tweets, "Now that Obama's poll numbers are in a tailspin, watch for him to launch a strike on Iran. He is desperate." This guy has been thinking about this for a while, right? This was 2011. This was 9 years ago. If I'm doing maybe 8 years ago. Anyhow, September 16th, 2013. This is Donald Trump tweeting, "I predict that President Obama will at some point attack Iran in order to save face." This guy has no idea what Iran is. He has never been there. He's probably never even seen pictures of Iran. He doesn't get it, that you're not talking about an Iraq that had been crippled by a decade of sanctions and a war George Herbert Walker Bush fought. And still, it's been, 15 years, something like that. We haven't been able to control Iraq, and we're going to take down Iran. Iran is a fully developed, fully modern country with a substantial military, by the way. So, but I don't think that Trump actually realizes this. And again, November 10th, 2013. "Remember that I predicted long ago that President Obama will attack Iran because of his inability to negotiate properly. He's not skilled." Right. So now we find out that he is actually lying, the Trump administration, because John Bolton wants his war, and Donald Trump thinks, hey, if I have a war, I'll get reelected. I wish the media would be paying more attention to this. So who was Soleimani, this guy that Trump assassinated, to the Iranian people? A number of Iranians called into our program today and shared their opinions with us. It's pretty enlightening. Check it out. Leave your comments. Ding the bell. Share it with your friends and subscribe to our channel. You are Iranian and you wanted to speak about Soleimani being a bad guy. Do I have that right?
Hi, Tom. How are you? I don't know. Should I ask you or you ask me questions? Because,
I'm guessing you know more about it than I do.
Forever. I'm following your program forever. I love you. I love your program. I support your program, Amy, and all these, programmers. So, but something is bothering me in Iranian because we feel you're not honest about something about Iran. You want to ask me a question, or can I?
Make your case.
Yeah, sure. My dad was in jail for 3 years because he's a journalist. We are, in
Iran,
like publish a book. Yeah, in Iran. So my cousins have been killed in the prison by these guys, these Soleimani. Soleimani, from your point of view, is a Major General Qasem Soleimani. From our point of view, he's a monster. Not he, because his group is a monstrous group. But, let me ask you this question. Less than 2 months ago, there was a big, huge, like, in Iran, there was people was in Iran in the street. They were striking against the regime of Iran.
You're right.
So they killed people in the street, and most of them was under 30 of age.
Yeah.
So they was pretty young.
Yes.
So they killed 1,500 people in the street, and also they took over 7,000 people in the jail, and they're torturing right now. They're torturing. Do you know who are they?
I don't.
Who are these people? They're torturing these people. This group, this Qasem Soleimani's group.
Sure. Yeah, it's the Quds Force. Yeah. I completely agree with you, Sohail.
My point is still, Tom. Still, I have a question. No,
Okay.
I didn't finish it.
Okay.
So I was following your program 2 months ago during that problems in Iran, during that strikes in Iran.
Mm-hmm.
You didn't even mention once about that people. But regarding to this Qasem Soleimani, you're talking about this monster every minute. That's bothering me because not you, not even Emmy, none of you were talking about people in Iran were killing.
Yes. Okay, thank you for putting that on the record, Sohail. I appreciate that. Now, let me ask you a question.
Sure.
During the time that people were out in the streets in Tehran protesting the Khamenei regime, and the Khamenei regime and Soleimani and his buddies and all the bad guys there killed all these people and imprisoned all these people, that was actually reducing the credibility of that regime and increasing, particularly among young people, the probability that there might even be, if not a political, a grassroots revolution may be too strong a word, but certainly blowback. I mean, there was discussion that this might be the end of the Khamenei regime, and the question was, is Rouhani enough of a moderate to make it through and end up being the guy who can bring Iran into a modern era, or is he going to have to go along with Khamenei, right? So that was the conversation that was going on a month ago in Iran and about Iran. Right now, the conversation that's going on in Iran is those American SOBs killed one of our top government officials, and we will not tolerate it, and we all had to pull together. What's happening in Iran right now, from what I'm seeing, and I'd love to hear your comments on this, is very much like what happened in the United States after 9/11. George Bush was a very unpopular president. He was considered, illegitimate, and yet everybody pulled together behind him. Is that not happening in Iran now, and therefore wasn't this a huge mistake on the part of Trump?
You care about the government of Iran, what they say. You don't care about the people of Iran, what do they say? So my point is, people, these monsters don't get killed by itself.
No, I get that, but what I'm saying is that Trump just gave the monsters more power.
100 years old, and they die naturally. So that's a fortune. That's a fortune that a big monster get killed. I don't care how, but these kind of monsters should have been killed everywhere.
In Los Angeles, it says here you're Iranian, and you have some thoughts to share on this.
Yes, hi.
Hi.
You just had somebody call himself Iranian talking about killing a monster. I just want to say that these people, actually, there are right-winger Americans who happen to be speaking Farsi and born in Iran. And they're mostly either pro-Shah people or pro-Mujahideen, MEK.
Right.
And they just go into the radios and try to do this. But you're asking the right question, that every time that the U.S. does this, does it make it better for the Iranian regime, Iranian government to get more powerful? And that's the truth. The U.S. government doesn't want to have a real revolution, a real change of the government in Iran, a democratic and freedom loving government in Iran. Just another puppet regime of the U.S., just like Shah. That's what they're looking for. And every time people try to do something in Iran, U.S. try to involve itself and not letting that happen. And the example is that just you can see that the last few days, millions of people of Iranian came to the streets to for Soleimani, General Soleimani, And that shows that, first of all, the people show that they are against what the U.S. did, and they don't want the U.S. to be involved with the Iranian affairs. And they don't want to have war with the U.S. in order to get rid of their own government. Mm-hmm. And these people, like the caller, they love to have the U.S. bomb Iran to destroy Iran and Iranian government so they can go back to the government as they. So
this would be like the Cuban Americans who came from Cuba, who had been very, very rich under Batista, and now they're all.
Exactly.
Okay, got it.
Exactly, they're the Cuban people in Florida that are
in Miami,
a bunch of them in Los Angeles. Yeah, a bunch of them are in Los Angeles. Yeah. And there is no countries in the world in the history that there are so many radio and TV stations and the newspaper that straight going to Iran and bombarding the people of Iran with the propaganda by the U.S. and Saudis, and all this money is going to Iran. And these people are just working for the CIA against the Iranian government. They're not working against the Iranian regime. They're working against the Iranian people and against the